Hey guys, tonight we're going to peel back a myth so legendary, so baked into childhood movies, dusty libraries and sword and sorcery fantasies that, yeah, you probably won't survive this. Not in one piece, anyway. We're headed straight into the real story behind King Arthur. Not the cartoonish plate armour wearing dude pulling a glowing sword from a rock while a choir of angels belts in the background. No, this one's murkier, grittier and way more confusing. A tangle of post-Roman warlords, forged manuscripts, cranky monks, and epic propaganda. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No Arthurian guilt trips. Also, where are you tuning in from? Drop your city and time in the comments. Always cool to see who's still up chasing history with me at 2:13 AM. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin not with a hero, but with a vacuum. It's around the year 410 CE. The Roman Empire, like a weary uncle at a chaotic family reunion, finally bails. After centuries of keeping the peace and collecting taxes, in Britain, the last legions march off, waving goodbye and leaving behind an island full of abandoned villas, crumbling roads, and a population that has no idea who's in charge anymore. There's no central government, no police, and definitely no king. Just chaos, and the creeping sense that things are about to get medieval in the worst way. You walk through this world, the air thick with damp mist and the scent of wood smoke. Towns that once thrived under Roman order now fester with anxiety. Some cling to crumbling Latin institutions, others revert to tribal loyalties and old Celtic gods. It's a mess. Imagine being left in your house with no phone service, no cops, no food trucks, and everyone around you suddenly thinks they should be king. Yeah, that's your intro to Arthur's world. The British elite who survived the Roman exit, wealthy landowners, ex-soldiers, minor aristocrats, try desperately to plug the holes. They keep using Roman titles like Dux Bellorum, Commander of War and Consul, even though those titles now mean roughly nothing. They build alliances with whoever will listen, including local bishops, Irish mercenaries, and yes, even the occasional Saxon warlord. The island fractures into micro-kingdoms, each with their own ambitions and spears pointed at everyone else. This is the environment where the Arthur legend might have started, because somebody had to step in. The first hint of that somebody comes not from a gleaming tale of destiny, but from silence, deafening scholarly silence. There's no clear mention of Arthur in the records from his supposed lifetime, not a whisper. And that, in a way, is even more haunting than the stories. It's like showing up to a party everyone swears happened, but the house is empty and the only thing on the floor is one muddy footprint. But maybe he wasn't a king. Maybe he was something closer to a warband leader. An agile, charismatic fighter keeping the fragile Romano-British world glued together with equal parts fear and flair. Imagine a battle-hardened commander leading horsemen across the moors, holding crumbling forts against waves of raiders, his name passed from one trembling survivor to the next. Arthur was here. Not a throne, but a reputation. And here's a wild fringe theory for your dream filing cabinet tonight. Some historians think Arthur wasn't a person at all, but a title, a name used by more than one warrior, possibly derived from the Welsh word arth, meaning bear. So maybe it wasn't the Arthur, but an Arthur, or several, like medieval code names for the baddest guy in the valley. Which makes you wonder, were the legends all just compressed stories of many warlords rolled into one legendary super dude? And then there's the debate, the one no one in the historical community can seem to shut up about. Did Arthur even exist at all? Serious scholars line up on both sides. One camp says absolutely yes, citing military logistics and cultural memory. The other insists he's a later invention, retrofitted into the past like a bad Photoshop job. In fact, there's not one universally agreed upon piece of contemporary evidence that directly ties the name Arthur to a single historical individual from this era. Not one. So you're not just chasing a ghost. You're chasing the idea of a ghost who might have been a composite of 3 other ghosts, all wearing the same name tag. Yet the vacuum Arthur fills is very real. People needed a story, a champion, someone who stood against the Saxon tide and made Britain feel strong again. And so the myth grew, fed by firelight stories, bardic songs, and eventually fancy Latin scribes with political agendas. The real King Arthur wasn't just a man, he was a symbol forged in the crucible of desperation and memory. And once a symbol catches fire in a culture, well, you try putting that out. You end the night staring at the smudged edge of history, standing in the ruins of a Roman bathhouse turned goat pen. Somewhere in this very building, a soldier once dried his boots and dreamed of retiring in peace. Instead, his descendants will fight for every inch of ground and whisper the name Arthur, like a ward against darkness. Whether Arthur was real, borrowed, or totally fabricated, you're about to spend the next 29 sections tracking his footsteps through war, myth, and the maddening, beautiful grey area in between. So now you're standing in the ruins of Roman Britain, surrounded by fog, chickens loose in what used to be a bathhouse, and the lingering scent of a civilization that's just walked out the door. You turn slowly, taking in the landscape. It's rough, broken, beautiful, and totally leaderless. Welcome to the first century of post-Roman chaos, a land without a king where the word Britain barely means anything anymore. After centuries of Roman rule, the people left behind are like kids whose babysitter just ghosted them mid-movie night. You've got aging aristocrats clinging to Roman customs, farmers just trying to keep wolves away from their sheep, and whole communities that have gone full tribal again. Because if no one's making the rules, you might as well start throwing your own feasts and electing your cousin as war chief. Some places try to keep Roman order going, others burn it down and never look back. The roads, those famous Roman roads, are still there, but they're pitted and overgrown. They're used now more for ambushes than trade. You travel down one of these old roads, the silence only broken by the distant clank of an axe or the bark of a watchdog. The towns have shrunk or been abandoned. The villas are mostly shells picked over by scavengers. A few lucky ones have become small fortresses with palisades built from chopped up furniture. Others, cemeteries with better views. And the Saxons are coming. They're not invaders yet, at least not officially. Early on, some of them are actually invited. Local British rulers hire them as mercenaries to fight off raiders from the north. Picts, Scots, Irish. But it's a bad deal. The Saxons are good at fighting, but they don't leave, and they like the climate more than they expected. So soon enough they start carving out their own territories, demanding more food, more land, and fewer rules. You've just watched the babysitter's dog take over the house. So who's running things? It depends on where you look. In some areas you've got petty kings, guys who used to be Roman officials or local big shots and now call themselves rex. Other places are led by bishops who wield more influence with a prayer and a pen than a sword. And in between, warlords. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all claiming divine favour, tribal loyalty and the right to your grain stores. You could wake up one morning ruled by a priest and by nightfall be pledging allegiance to a dude named Ironback Mervyn. And then there's the twist, Christianity. It's growing fast and it's got its own power base now. The Roman Church left its footprints all over Britain, and while the imperial government pulled out, the bishops did not. You walk into a crumbling basilica and find a monk copying the gospel by candlelight, while outside, a local warband drinks fermented goat milk and sharpened spears. It's a weird mix, old Roman religion giving way to newer Christian ideology, fused with whatever local tradition still lingers in the soil. You're standing at a cultural crossroads. Latin is fading but not gone. Old Celtic tongues are on the rise again, and new legends are being born, whispered around fires by people who remember the good days, or pretend to. This is when oral tradition becomes currency. People need hope. They need someone to rally behind, and even if they have to invent that someone, they will. A few names start to emerge from the fog of time. Ambrosius Aurelianus, Vortigern, Hengist, Horsa, some are Romanized Britons, others Saxon chiefs, all of them tangled in half-truths and disputed chronologies. But Arthur? Not yet. If he's out there, he's still just a story passed from warrior to warrior, a name etched on a shield or shouted across a battlefield. No scribe is writing about him. Yet. But you can feel him forming. The stage is set, the people are desperate, and desperation is fertile ground for myth-making. Some local strongman wins a few battles and gets deified in song. Another holds off Saxon raiders and becomes the bear of the West. And somewhere maybe one man or a dozen men earn the name that will echo for centuries. It's just that nobody's calling him king yet. And let's be honest, this wasn't the kind of kingdom that came with jewelled thrones and velvet robes. You picture Arthur as a gritty fighter, eating dried venison in a smoky hall with dogs at his feet and rain seeping through the roof. His council might be just 3 other guys who haven't betrayed him yet. His castle could be a timber fort on a hilltop, half burned and constantly under siege. There's no Camelot, not yet, maybe not ever. Here's a weird but very real historical side note. In this period, some warlords were so desperate to prove their legitimacy, they would dig up ancient Roman coins and hand them out like business cards. Imagine some guy holding up a cracked silver denarius and shouting, "See, I'm basically Caesar." It was all about appearing connected to something older, stronger, and more legitimate than the fractured now. And yet people believed. Because in a world this chaotic, belief isn't optional. It's armour. It's political currency. And if someone started saying they served under a great war leader named Arthur, you can bet others would claim the same. Maybe it made them sound braver. Maybe it scared the Saxons. Or maybe it was true. This era doesn't give you answers. It gives you echoes, ruins, and contradictions. But it also gives you a feeling, a low, steady beat beneath the surface. The sense that somewhere in the shadows of collapsing Roman towns and storm-swept hill forts, someone did something extraordinary. Not because they were fated to, but because no one else stepped up. And that's where Arthur fits. Not as a king with a golden crown, but as a shape rising out of the fog, drawn by the collective need for a champion. He's not historical fact, not yet, but he's becoming a presence, a rumour, a hope. You squint into the grey dawn and picture a figure on horseback, wrapped in wolfskin, sword strapped to his back, watching the Saxon ships land on the eastern shore. No banners, no trumpets, just resolve. Maybe this is where he starts. You wake to the sound of boots, leather against stone, fast and purposeful, not Roman sandals anymore, but rougher hand-stitched footwear caked in dirt from some forgotten trail. You're deep inside post-Roman Britain now, and it's time to get familiar with the kind of people left holding the map after the Empire packed up. The ones historians can barely categorise because they don't fit neat labels. They aren't Roman, they aren't fully Celtic, they aren't quite Saxon. They're something in between, the Romano-British. You step into one of their homes, a villa that still has part of a mosaic floor. Dust covers the patterned tiles, and chickens peck at old frescoes. The smell of wet straw mixes with burning peat, and someone in the back is boiling herbs over an open fire. It's not luxury, but it's survival. These people cling to what's left of Roman order like it's a half-floating door in a shipwreck. They dress in old tunics, speak Latin sprinkled with Welsh or Brittonic, and teach their children Roman history they barely understand anymore. They write, but sloppily. They pray, but to a version of Christianity warped by isolation. And here's where the mystery starts to deepen. This cultural mashup is where Arthur might have belonged. Not a Celtic prince, not a Roman general, but a bridge between 2 crumbling worlds, a man fluent in both swordplay and ceremony, someone who could rally tribes, negotiate with bishops, and terrify Saxons with Latin war cries. You start to understand why someone like that would be remembered. He wouldn't just win battles, he'd make people feel like the centre hadn't quite fallen. You sit down with an old manuscript, not one written in Arthur's time, but close enough to make you squint. It's filled with strange spelling and theological rants, but between the lines something jumps out. Names. Vortigern, Ambrosius, Aurelius. These aren't legends, they're people historians think might have actually existed. And tucked between their stories there's a figure who starts to appear in later sources, Artorius. Lucius Artorius Castus, to be exact. Now we're getting weird, because Lucius wasn't British, he was a Roman military commander who served in the 2nd or 3rd century. Yeah, that early. But his name pops up because some think he might have been the seed of the Arthur myth. He commanded Sarmatian cavalry, a fierce eastern horse-riding people sent to Britain by Rome. Some stayed after service. Their traditions? Battle-hardened, horse-loving, sword-wielding, and full of legendary warrior leader tales. You see where this is going? Could Artorius have inspired Arthur? That's the theory. A Roman commander turned local legend, whose name evolved into something more folkloric. Maybe people forgot the details over time, blending his deeds with later British heroes. It wouldn't be the first time history folded in on itself like a poorly kept scroll. Scholars debate this hard. Some say there's no way Artorius survived in the oral memory for 300 years. Others argue that legendary figures often do, especially when no one else is stepping up to fill the myth vacuum. So here's a juicy fringe fact. In the Sarmatian warrior tradition, Warriors would sometimes carry banners with dragon heads, and their swords were passed down as sacred relics. Sound familiar? There's a tale of Arthur carrying a dragon-shaped standard into battle, and of course wielding a legendary sword. Maybe it's a coincidence. Or maybe it's what happens when one culture's icon gets stitched into the tapestry of another's survival narrative. Back in your villa, you thumb through an old shield on the wall, more decorative than useful now, cracked and mossy. But for a moment, you imagine what it would have been like to watch a Romano-British war leader ride past on horseback, flanked by loyal warriors, armoured in half-Roman, half-tribal gear. He'd be terrifying to enemies, a walking contradiction. His Latin orders barked out over the hills, his prayers a blend of Christ and battlefield tradition. Someone like that would have stood out, would have earned songs even if his real name wasn't Arthur. But don't get too cosy with the Artorius theory. Not everyone's buying it. Some historians say it's too neat, too convenient, that the only link is the name similarity. They argue the Arthur we're chasing came much later, born of British oral traditions, not Roman cavalry stories, and there's no concrete evidence placing Lucius Artorius Castus in Britain during the right time frame to inspire anything directly. It could just be the academic version of conspiracy theory with a fancy Latin gloss. Still, you can't shake the feeling that something happened. The Romano-British weren't just idly collapsing, they were adapting, fighting, reshaping their identity, and Arthur, real or not, embodied that. He was what they needed, not a perfect Roman, not a pure Celt, but a third thing, a hybrid hero. You wander through a graveyard now, the stones are lopsided, many unmarked, but the bones beneath tell stories. Some wear marks of violent death, others carry signs of hard labour. Few have fancy jewellery or coins. This isn't a wealthy society anymore. The elite are disappearing, and with them, written records. This is how history gets blurry, not because people didn't live, but because no one had time to write it down. Which is why for Arthur, silence isn't absence, it's camouflage. And just for flavour, there's one more bizarre detail. Some scattered bits of Welsh legend say Arthur could fight off entire armies on his own, that he was immune to death unless it came from a certain spear, that he could see omens in the sky. These don't sound like details born from courtly poems written centuries later. They sound like battlefield stories told over and over until they became myth. And myths don't need paperwork, just memory. So you close your imaginary manuscript, brush off your cloak and leave the cracked villa. You're walking deeper into a world that remembers Rome like a dream, but wakes up every day in the mud and blood of post-imperial Britain. Somewhere in that mud, Arthur is beginning to take shape, and you're just starting to see the outline. The morning mist hangs low over the hilltops, a pale veil that blurs the jagged lines of the land like an artist hesitating on the edge of a masterpiece. You're standing at the crossroads of speculation and possibility, watching history warp itself into story. You've seen the chaos of post-Roman Britain. You've felt the cultural tug of war. And now, it's time to meet your first real contender for the throne of the real Arthur, a man known to historians as Lucius Artorius Castus. Say it out loud, it feels heavy, official, like someone who would absolutely command troops and lecture you about boot polish. But the real question is, was this man the origin point for the Arthur legend? Some scholars think so, others roll their eyes and go back to deciphering 9th century scribbles in candlelight. You're here to poke around and see if the theory actually breathes. Lucius Artorius Castus is no medieval warlord. He's Roman, like full-on toga-wearing, Latin-speaking, scroll-reading Roman. But not the pampered senator kind. He's a soldier. A career military man who probably smelled more of leather and sweat than of olive oil and poetry. The guy led troops across the Roman Empire, possibly even commanding Sarmatian cavalry. And according to a stone inscription found in Croatia, he ended up in Britain as a prefect. A commander. Now the Sarmatian connection, that's where it gets juicy. These weren't your average infantrymen. The Sarmatians were armoured, horse-riding nightmares trained in brutal, fast-moving tactics. They came from the steppes with ornate gear and traditions that included sacred swords, banner rituals, and warlords who often doubled as tribal heroes. Rome brought 5,000 of them into Britain during the 2nd century, posted along Hadrian's Wall to keep the wild north in check. So imagine this, a Roman commander leading an elite band of Sarmatian warriors riding through the misty hills of northern Britain. Long after he's gone, their descendants remain, mixed into local bloodlines, camped in hill forts, maybe still whispering tales of an unbeatable leader with a sharp sword and a sharper mind. It's not hard to see how over time Lucius Artorius Castus morphs into something bigger. Not just a man, but a symbol. Something you don't just remember, you mythologise. And here's where the lines get extra fuzzy. The name Artorius could have evolved phonetically into Arthur. Latin to Welsh to Old English, each step a telephone game where names get warped. So what started as Lucius Artorius in stone might have become Arthur the war leader in song. Is it definitive? No. Is it compelling? Oh, absolutely. But let's pause and throw some scholarly cold water on this campfire. There's a problem. The timelines don't match up perfectly. Castus served centuries before the traditional Arthurian time frame. By the 5th or 6th century, when most theories place Arthur, Lucius would have been long dead. Like, your grandkids' bedtime stories, dead. Which leads critics to argue that there's no way Castus directly influenced the legend. The gap's too wide. Legends might stretch a generation or two, but 300 years is asking a lot. Unless those stories lived on in the Sarmatian families stationed in Britain. Unless they kept telling tales of their great commander, and unless those tales got picked up by the local Britons, hungry for heroes. Here's a little scholarly side-eye moment for you. Some believe the entire Castus theory is just modern myth-making. A way to give Arthur a respectable Roman pedigree, as if being a tribal warlord wasn't classy enough. But others push back, saying history often bubbles up from these blurry roots, especially when it involves legendary figures. You can almost hear the debates happening in some Oxford pub. He's too early. No, he's the template. Pass the bitter ale, Geoffrey. Now take a breath and look around. You're walking through a landscape that remembers all of this, even if it doesn't say so aloud. Hills dotted with ruined watchtowers, ancient Roman roads that still carve lines into the earth long after the boots stop marching. You feel it in the stone, in the silence between wind gusts. The past is here. It's just not labelled. You reach a lonely outpost, what used to be a Roman fort. Grass is reclaiming the walls, sheep graze on what was once a parade ground. And in a forgotten corner, someone's piled rocks into a makeshift cairn. Maybe it's a modern tribute. Or maybe it's been there for centuries. Either way, you stand still, picturing Castus, back straight, voice like iron, rallying cavalry against some northern threat. Did he see himself as a legend? Probably not. Most real heroes don't. They just do the job and try not to get stabbed in the kidneys. But what matters is what came after him. If Castus is the seed of Arthur, then that seed grew in a Britain desperate for structure, identity, and someone to believe in. And here's a quirky twist. Some Sarmatian swords were believed to have mystical properties, passed down like holy relics, sometimes buried with their owners. One legend even claims the blade would choose its next wielder, a detail that echoes eerily in later tales of Excalibur. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe it's another thread in this tangled historical sweater. The hilltop wines pick up. You zip your imaginary cloak tighter. Castus has given you a lens, but not the full picture. Whether or not he was Arthur, his story shows how fragile the line between fact and legend really is. One carved name in stone, one cavalry charge in the mist, and suddenly he's riding into the realm of folklore. You walk away from the ruins and glance back once. Not because you expect to see a ghost, but because honestly it would fit. If Arthur was ever real, even a little bit, this is where he might have first appeared. Not with a crown, but with a worn saddle and a reputation that refused to die. You crouch in a cold, stone-walled library, dust suspended in lazy, golden shafts of light, unrolling a brittle manuscript that smells like it gave up on being useful about 8 centuries ago. Your fingers trace faded ink, and somewhere between a rambling genealogy and a monk's rant about virtue, it hits you. The earliest mentions of Arthur aren't grand at all. They're not epic. They're not even stories. They're footnotes, scribbles, tiny little literary hiccups on the margins of real history. Welcome to one of the strangest facts in the whole Arthurian saga. Before he was the king of Camelot, Arthur was a side note in some obscure chronicles. No court, no Merlin, no sword in a rock. Just a name dropped casually, like you're supposed to already know who he is. The oldest of these is the Historia Brittonum, written in the 9th century and attributed to a guy named Nennius. And yeah, if you're keeping track, that's already about 300 years after Arthur supposedly lived, not exactly hot off the press reporting. In this text, Arthur isn't even called a king. He's described as a dux bellorum, a war leader, and the monk throws in a battle list. 12 of them, in fact. You're squinting at a rough catalogue of carnage, places like the River Glane and Mount Badon. No flowery prose, no romantic setup, just, here's this guy Arthur, and here's a bunch of Saxons he murdered. But the thing that really slaps you in the face is this. Mount Badon, a battle supposedly so important it delayed the Saxon advance for a generation, is directly linked to Arthur only here, in this text. None of the earlier sources, not even the ones written closer to the supposed time of the battle, mention Arthur as being involved at all. Gildas, the cranky monk we'll get to later, writes about the battle with dramatic flair, but doesn't name names. It's like watching a war movie where the main character is missing and everyone just pretends not to notice. So now the questions start stacking up. If Arthur was really such a big deal, why didn't Gildas mention him? Why did no contemporary source celebrate this heroic defender of Britain until centuries after he supposedly lived? Did Nennius make him up? Or was he working from oral stories that had already blended fact and fantasy into a single, unstoppable warlord smoothie? And what about those battles? That famous list, 12th encounters, one bloodier than the last, is a hot mess. Historians have tried for years to map them onto real-world locations, but it's like throwing darts at a fog bank. Some places don't exist anymore, others have names that could refer to 2 or 3 different sites, depending on the century. Some even think the list is more symbolic than historical, with the number 12 serving a biblical purpose, echoing the 12 tribes of Israel or the 12 apostles, which would make Arthur less of a field commander and more of a Christ-like stand-in for a fallen people. You see where the lines start to blur? And here's your quirky fact of the night. In one version of the list, Arthur supposedly kills 960 men in a single charge at the Battle of Badon. By himself. You read that again and blink. Not his army, not his cavalry, just Arthur. 960 dudes felled by one guy in one day. Even if he had a whole weekend, you'd still have to ask what his arm was made of, steel or unfiltered medieval exaggeration. Let's be honest, this is not history. This is myth wearing history's coat and hoping you don't check the label. But it matters because this is where the legend begins to take root. This is the first time Arthur gets framed not just as a warrior, but as the warrior. A semi-supernatural juggernaut standing between Britain and the chaos to the east. It's a compelling image. Probably too compelling. Still, not everyone agrees. There's a scholarly debate, naturally, that says the Historia Brittonum was less about preserving memory and more about shaping it. Some historians argue that Nennius was writing during a time of political upheaval and needed a national hero, a unifying figure. Arthur, whether real or legendary, fit the bill. So Nennius might have collected campfire stories and strung them together with names of old battles, slapping Arthur on top like a coat of historical varnish. Other scholars go deeper. They suggest Nennius didn't even write the text alone, that it's an evolving document added to by generations of scribes, each with their own spin. Imagine if Wikipedia had no moderators and every edit stuck forever. That's what you're working with here. A big, messy, collaborative myth with no fact-check button. Now let's slide over to the Annales Cambriae, another medieval manuscript that's even murkier. In its brief entries, Arthur pops up exactly twice. One line claims he fought at Mount Badon. The other says he died at the Battle of Camelot. That's it. 2 sentences, no details, no drama. Just a timestamp of death like a cosmic thanks for playing. But here's the kicker. Those entries were added later than the rest of the chronicle. Maybe a full century or 2 after the supposed events. So again, you're not getting real-time Arthur. You're getting edited Arthur. Curated, cleaned up and inserted neatly into the timeline like a guest showing up late to a party and pretending they've been there all along. By now, you're starting to see how fragile the historical Arthur really is. There's no clear evidence, no contemporary eyewitness accounts, no sword inscribed with property of King Arthur. Just a few scattered mentions, some wildly inflated kill counts, and a whole lot of theological undertones. The more you look, the more he disappears, until all you're left with is the story about the story. A myth so tangled in the record that pulling one thread risks unravelling the whole post-Roman fabric. But maybe that's the point. Maybe Arthur was never supposed to be pinned down. Maybe he was built to slip through your fingers. Half history, half hope. And in this section of your journey, squinting at ancient texts and counting impossible body piles, you realise something important. Legends don't need to be real to be powerful. They just need to be believed in the right moment by the right people. And clearly someone, some monk, some bard, some desperate warlord trying to keep morale up, believed in Arthur enough to write his name down in the margin. You're still in the manuscript room, the kind of place that smells like parchment, mildew, and stress. The librarian's long gone to bed, but you're sitting there, hunched over a candle like an obsessed monk, because something's bugging you. That list of battles from Historia Brittonum, the one where Arthur allegedly solo murdered almost 1,000 Saxons. Yeah, that one. You can't stop thinking about it. 12 battles. A convenient number, just biblical enough to make you suspicious, just grounded enough to feel like maybe, there's something real underneath all the moss. So you grab a quill, mentally anyway, and go to work, picking apart this list like a detective in a crime drama, only your victim is historical certainty. The first thing that hits you is this. None of the battles are dated, not a single year. They just unspool in rapid succession. Like a montage in an action film, cue the music, Arthur swings his sword, next scene. There's no sense of when or why these battles happened, just a sequence of bloodletting across vaguely British-sounding place names. Some of them are rivers, some hills, some you can't even locate anymore. It's like trying to GPS your way through Narnia. Let's look at a few. There's the River Glane, maybe in Lincolnshire, maybe in Neverland. Then the Dubglas in the region of Linus. No one knows where that is. The Celadon Forest. That could be the Caledonian Forest in Scotland, but it could also be poetic nonsense. And Badon, oh, we'll get to Badon. The others, take your pick. Every county from Cornwall to Cumbria claims at least one of them. It's a historical buffet, and everyone wants a slice of Arthur on their local signage. So what are we even looking at here? One theory is that the battle list is a patchwork, a greatest hits compilation pulled from various regional tales and sewn together to create a unified national hero. Kind of like a Spotify playlist of Britain's best Saxon kicking moments, all attributed to one man. Even if half of them originally belonged to other warriors or completely different centuries, you slap Arthur's name on it and suddenly the story has legs. But not everyone's buying that. Some scholars argue the list has a military logic to it, that it traces the path of a campaign. The battles start in the north and sweep down into southern Britain, like Arthur was on some grand tour of ass-kicking. Which would mean, if any of this is real, you're looking at a master tactician, someone orchestrating defences across multiple regions. That doesn't sound like a tribal thug or a lucky warlord. That sounds like a general with serious logistical skill. But again, that's assuming the list reflects something real and not just a mythic travel itinerary with a body count. Now here's a strange but oddly delightful fringe theory. Some people believe the 12 battles weren't fought by Arthur at all, but by a god. Or more accurately, that Arthur is a Christianized version of an earlier Celtic battle deity, someone whose victories were folded into a human narrative once pagan gods fell out of favour. Think about it. 12 battles, no dates, no specifics, all victories. Doesn't that sound a little too neat? Like something you'd tell a child who asked why the sun rises. Because Arthur fought off the darkness. It's poetic, sure. It's also hard to prove wrong, and that's part of the frustration, isn't it? This list has just enough detail to feel real, but not enough to prove anything. It's the historical equivalent of hearing a friend say they saw Bigfoot and then pulling out a blurry photo of a guy in a shag rug. You want to believe, but the evidence is just smoke and legend. But let's talk about the one bright flare in the middle of all this fog, Mount Badon. This battle stands out partly because it's also mentioned by earlier sources, notably Gildas, who hated giving people credit but still said the battle was a big win for the Britons. He didn't name Arthur, of course, because Gildas was more interested in yelling at sinners than recording military history, but the fact that multiple sources mention Badon gives it weight. Something happened there. We just don't know what or who made it happen. If Arthur did fight there, it would explain a lot. A stunning victory like that could have cemented him in the public memory, even if his name didn't make it into the first wave of written accounts. Oral history has a weird way of selecting what sticks and what fades. Maybe the man who held Badon became a legend in songs long before he showed up in any manuscript. Maybe Arthur was less of a person and more of a placeholder, a name you attach to the victory because it feels right. But don't get too romantic. For every historian who supports the idea of Arthur leading these battles, there's another ready to pop that balloon. Some claim the entire list is later invention. Nennius, or whoever edited him, just made it up to stir patriotism or lend weight to Britain's mythical past. Others say it's a composite, gluing together multiple heroes into one super warrior, which would explain why Arthur seems to be everywhere at once, always winning, always surviving, until suddenly, at the Battle of Camelot, he doesn't. And here's a weird scholarly mic drop moment. Even the idea that the battles happened at all is debated. Some researchers argue the list might not be historical at all, but allegorical, that each battle represents a moral or spiritual triumph, which would mean you're not looking at military campaigns, you're looking at a medieval sermon with body counts. So where does that leave you? Right here in a candlelit room surrounded by scrolls and second guesses, trying to separate fact from propaganda. You want so badly to find something solid, a sword in a stone and a body in a crypt, a letter signed Arthur. What you get is a list. 12 names, half real, half dream. Ledger of violence stitched together with just enough vagueness to be immune to confirmation or denial. And still, something about it feels ancient and powerful and oddly believable. Because whether it was one man or many, Britain did resist. There were battles, someone did rally the scattered tribes. And if the stories decided to call that someone Arthur, well, that's as real as it gets in a world that lives off myth. So you roll up the manuscript, blow out the candle, and walk out into the early morning light. The battlefields are gone, the names are blurred, but the legend marches on, blood-streaked, half-lost and stubborn as ever. You're standing on a wind-blasted ridge overlooking a patchwork of green and grey, where sheep outnumber people and the only sounds are the distant bleats and the occasional caw of a crow that probably thinks it runs the place. Beneath your feet are the broken bones of a long-dead fortress. A hill fort, actually. Massive earthworks, ancient stone foundations, overgrown and sunken in places, but still defiant. And you're thinking, quietly, could this have been Camelot? Not the shining city with turrets and trumpet fanfare, but the real thing? A rough-hewn stronghold where a warlord with a big sword and even bigger ambitions tried to hold back the dark. Because let's be clear, Camelot, as we know it, is a much later invention. No medieval castle, no stained glass, no spiral staircases where Guinevere sighs dramatically. The earliest stories of Arthur don't mention a fixed capital at all. In fact, it wasn't until the 12th century that a writer decided Arthur needed real estate. Before that, he was a moving target, a battle leader, always on the road, rallying warbands and hitting Saxons wherever they landed. Which brings you here, to these fortresses, these old ghostly hilltops. There are dozens of them scattered across Britain. Dinas Emery's, Cadbury Castle, Tintagel, South Cadbury Hill. They rise from the landscape like buried memories, vibrant and sturdy. And every single one has at some point been claimed as the Camelot. Locals will point to a ditch or a moss-covered slab of wall and say, that's where Arthur feasted, or he rode out from there to fight the Saxons. You start to see the pattern. Give a place a legend, and it'll grow roots fast. Let's talk Cadbury Castle for a second. Not a castle in the fairy tale sense, no drawbridge, no moat, no chandeliered halls. But it's big, massive even. Its earthworks sprawl out across a Somerset hill like a giant shrugged and said, this looks like a good spot to defend forever. Archaeologists have found evidence of reoccupation during the exact time Arthur would have lived, 5th or 6th century. There's a strong suggestion it was refurbished, maybe even by someone with enough power to command hundreds of men. That, you'll admit, is promising. Even more tantalising? When 16th century historian John Leland visited the site, he reported locals referring to it as Camelot. Coincidence? Convenient mispronunciation? Or a name carried down through oral tradition so stubbornly that it left a breadcrumb trail to the truth? It's impossible to say, but it's the kind of detail that makes your palms itch with curiosity. And then there's Tintagel, the coastal fortress in Cornwall perched dramatically on a rocky outcrop where the sea smashes itself into history every few seconds. This place is pure drama. Wind, waves, craggy cliffs. It's traditionally linked to Arthur's conception, because of course it is. Geoffrey of Monmouth decided this was the location where Uther Pendragon, magically disguised, seduced Igraine and created baby Arthur. Never mind that Geoffrey was writing fiction. Tintagel is now immortal. Bonus fact, archaeologists did find a slate here in the 90s, inscribed with the name Artorius. It's not Arthur, but it's close enough to send conspiracy theorists sprinting for their notebooks. But let's zoom out. These hill forts were never Camelot in the storybook sense. They were defensive strongholds, homes for local elites, places of power where a big man with a big army might set up shop for a while. In Arthur's day, if he had a day, these forts would have been patched with timber palisades, soap curling from hearths, warriors sharpening blades and arguing over who took the last bit of salted pork. Not elegant, but effective. And more importantly, plausible. You touch the rough stone of one ancient wall and feel the damp lichen stick to your fingers. It's not exactly majestic, but it's real. And that's the crux of this whole section. We may never know where Arthur actually lived or ruled, if he lived at all, but the idea that he used one of these hill forts as a base makes sense. They were the best defensive options around. High ground, thick walls, visibility for miles. A warlord in post-Roman Britain wouldn't choose a palace. He'd choose a fortress, preferably one already built by someone else and left behind when Rome bailed. And here's a quirky archaeological tidbit to file away. At South Cadbury Hill, they found shards of Mediterranean pottery dating to the exact period in question. That means someone was importing luxury goods all the way from Byzantium while holding off Saxon raids. Whoever lived there wasn't just surviving, they were thriving, or at least pretending to. That kind of wealth, even in fragments, suggests power, and possibly a political centre, a regional king, or at least someone people didn't say no to. So could South Cadbury be the real Camelot? Or was it another Arthur? Or another warlord entirely whose story got folded into Arthur's like too many layers in a mythic pastry? You're not going to get a definitive answer, of course, that's not how this works, but what you do get is a feeling, an image of a man cloaked in wool and strategy, leaning over a crude wooden map table in the heart of a fortress just like this, planning raids, defending villages, becoming a name worth whispering across generations. Now the academic debate. Because of course there's a debate. Some scholars love the idea of hill forts as Arthur's bases, others think it's all romantic projection. They argued that no one site shows enough continuity to link directly to him, that all we're doing is projecting legend onto ruins because the ruins are conveniently photogenic. But here's the pushback. Why would there be continuity? Britain in the 5th century was chaos. Records were rare, populations moved, forts got reused and renamed. If Arthur had a home base, it might have vanished without a trace, or been misattributed by scribes with better imaginations than fact-checkers. You look out over the hills one last time before the fog rolls in again, swallowing the fortress in mist. This isn't Camelot, not as you were told. There's no harp music, no suits of armour, no dramatic declarations in Old French, just grass, wind, rock, and silence. But in that silence, maybe, just maybe, Arthur rode once, not a king with a crown, but a commander with a cause. You're ankle deep in boggy grass, eyes fixed on the horizon where thin wisps of smoke rise like a warning. Out there, past the forests and the marshes, the Saxons are coming, or more accurately, they're already here. This isn't the first wave either. It started quietly like a leaking pipe in the back of a house no one's watching. But now the flood has begun, and you're wading into one of the most brutal, transformative invasions in British history. And yes, it's where Arthur, whoever he really was, might have carved out his legend in blood and fury. Back up a bit. In the early days, the Saxons weren't technically invaders. They were mercenaries, hired muscle. Britain had enemies on all sides, the Irish, the Picts, raiders from the sea, bandits, famine. Desperate Romano-British leaders, with no Roman military to lean on, started paying Germanic warbands to do their dirty work. These were the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, tribes from across the North Sea, brought in to fight, protect, and, in theory, leave once the job was done. You probably already guessed, they didn't. Picture them arriving on shallow draft boats, long hair braided, axes slung casually over shoulders, and a collective attitude of, "Nice island you've got here, we think we'll stay." These weren't just random brutes, they had strategy. They settled first along the coasts and rivers, easy trade routes, fertile land, and plenty of wide-eyed locals. At first, they probably coexisted, more or less. Trading, marrying, making awkward small talk in broken Latin and Old Germanic. But like any good guest who overstays, things eventually got ugly. The turning point, according to some legends, came when the Saxons demanded more land and food. When they didn't get it, they burned, pillaged and killed. And when they got what they wanted, they burned and pillaged anyway. It became less of a service agreement and more of a hostile takeover. The British started to push back, but by then the Saxons had numbers, weapons, and a growing appetite for conquest. Now enter you standing in the middle of this rising tide, watching villages burn and hearing stories of a warrior who refuses to give up. A leader who doesn't wait in a palace but rides out to meet the threat. This is where Arthur begins to feel more real, not because of a specific date or a specific battle, but because someone had to lead the resistance. And resistance did happen. Gildas, our favourite angry monk, wrote a scathing sermon sometime in the 6th century. He doesn't name Arthur, but he does describe a great battle at Mount Badon, where the Saxons were stopped cold. According to Gildas, the victory was so complete that peace lasted for decades. That's rare in this period. Peace was usually measured in seasons. A whole generation? That's something. It suggests not just a fluke win, but a serious defensive effort. An organised pushback that left a deep mark. Some historians believe this era of resistance was marked by loose alliances among the remaining British tribes. Temporary coalitions built out of necessity, and someone had to unify those fractious groups, however briefly. Someone charismatic, smart, ruthless enough to unite proud warbands and semi-Christian hill chiefs who probably hated each other's cloaks. That's where Arthur makes sense. As the name that got attached to a real but now nameless effort to hold the line. Here's where things get spicy. Some sources, Welsh mostly, talk about the enemies from the east. It's always the east. That's where the Saxons landed, and that's where the fiercest resistance seems to have taken place. Some of the battle sites linked to this cluster around those eastern inroads. Kent, Sussex, the Thames Valley. But of course, the further west you go in Britain today, the stronger the Arthurian pull. Wales, Cornwall, even parts of Scotland. They all claim a piece of him. Why? Because as the Saxons moved in, the Britons were pushed west. Retreat became legend, and Arthur, whoever he really was, became their shield. Now here's your fringe fat candy for tonight. There's a theory that the Saxons didn't just take over, they rewrote history afterward. That once they became the dominant culture, they deliberately erased or downplayed British heroes like Arthur. So the fact that we know anything about him might be thanks to oral traditions that clung on in the Celtic fringe. Stories told in whispers while Saxon scribes scribbled new, more flattering versions of the past. And scholars do argue about this. Some think the Saxons assimilated faster than we give them credit for, that it wasn't all fire and murder, but more of a slow cultural merger. That Arthur might have been forgotten not because of Saxon censorship, but because he just didn't matter anymore once the cultural narrative changed. Others say, nope, it was a violent conquest and Arthur's was a casualty of propaganda and time. What's undeniable is this. The Saxons didn't just take land, they changed everything. Language, religion, settlement patterns. They pushed the surviving Britons into the corners of the island and started building the England we'd eventually recognise. So if Arthur really lived, he was standing on a crumbling ledge, holding on to the last threads of Roman-British civilization while the flood rose around him. And yet he mattered. He was remembered. In some of the oldest Welsh poetry, he's already becoming myth. Not a polished king, but a warrior, brutal, proud, half wild. Not someone who wore a golden crown, but someone who could split you open with a single blow and then go hunting before breakfast. You see a very different Arthur here. Less noble, more terrifying, more Beowulf than Lancelot, which honestly feels right for this part of history. So as the smoke from the imaginary Saxon raid fades into your dreams, you picture him again. Not seated on a throne, but knee-deep in the mud, covered in blood and glory, roaring commands over the clash of shields. A man who may have had no idea he'd become a legend, only that he had no choice but to fight. You find yourself deep inside the mind of a man who's both incredibly important and profoundly irritating, Gildas. Think of him as the original doom-scrolling blogger of 6th century Britain. Only instead of Twitter rants, he wrote a treatise called De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, which roughly translates to On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, and ruin is right. Gildas does not pull punches. He is equal parts fire, brimstone, passive-aggressive spiritual guilt trip, and political takedown artist. His writing is the kind of thing that makes you want to sit down and repent for sins you didn't even commit. Now here's the strange part. He's one of the only near contemporary voices we have for this period. Born probably in the early 500s, Gildas was alive during or just after the time Arthur is usually said to have lived, which means if Arthur was really a thing, if he truly stood tall against the Saxons and became a beacon of British resistance, Gildas should have known, or at least mentioned him, right? Nope, not once. Not a single Artorius, not even a casual nod to a legendary warlord. Instead, he credits the victory at the Battle of Mount Badon, the same battle Arthur is tied to in later sources, to divine punishment against the Saxons. God apparently decided enough was enough and handed the Britons a break. That's it. Gildas does name some kings in his tirade, and he absolutely hates them, calling them tyrants, murderers, and worse. But Arthur is noticeably absent. It's like writing a review of a rock concert and forgetting to mention the lead singer. So now you're stuck with the million-pound question. If Arthur really was the hero of Mount Badon, why doesn't Gildas say so? Some scholars argue that maybe Gildas didn't mention him because Arthur didn't exist. That's the Occam's razor approach. He's not in the text because he wasn't around to be mentioned. End of story. Others suggest something subtler. Maybe Arthur was real, but he wasn't royalty, and Gildas only cared about kings. Or maybe Arthur was so revered by Gildas's time that mentioning him would have overshadowed Gildas's real goal, to spiritually roast Britain like it was a Sunday joint. And here's a fringe theory that's just spicy enough to be fun. Some say Arthur may have been politically toxic by the time Gildas wrote his screed. Imagine a once-beloved general who fell out of favour, or whose legacy became controversial. If Gildas wanted his message to be taken seriously by certain audiences, it might have been smarter to leave Arthur out altogether. Conveniently omitted, like the cousin everyone knows did time, but nobody brings up at reunions. Another theory, Gildas was just being petty. Yep, historians have proposed that Gildas may have had personal or regional reasons to leave Arthur out. Maybe he didn't like Arthur's supporters. Maybe Arthur was from a rival territory. The Dark Ages were full of grudges, and monks were not above using their scrolls for a little well-placed historical ghosting. But before you get too frustrated, understand this. Gildas didn't write history the way we think of it today. His work is more sermon than record, more angry Facebook post than accurate war log. He wasn't interested in glorifying warriors or even documenting military events. His whole purpose was to shame the British people, especially the ruling elite, into repentance. So if Arthur didn't fit that narrative, he was cut. Simple as that. Still, his succulence is loud, because while Gildas leaves Arthur out, he does describe the events surrounding Badon in a way that suggests it was genuinely significant. The Saxons were pushed back. Peace lasted a generation. That's not just a moral footnote, it's a military high point. And someone, somewhere led that fight. Gildas might have ignored the name, but the outline remains. The island was on fire, and someone helped extinguish it. This is where the legend starts to creep back in. Later writers couldn't resist the vacuum Gildas left. They plugged Arthur into the gap, turning him into the central figure of Britain's resistance. In their minds, it couldn't have been just God. It had to be a man, a leader, a champion who embodied divine justice with a sword in hand. And once that story caught on, Arthur became the lens through which everyone saw the Saxon wars. Now let's zoom in on Gildas himself. Imagine a man in threadbare robes pacing a stone chapel, yelling at a wall because no one else will listen. He's obsessed with sin, corruption, and decay. He names kings, Constantine of Dumnonia, Vortipor of Demetia, Maelgwyn of Gwynedd, and he trashes every one of them. Cowards, liars, perverts. Honestly, if Gildas had Twitter, he'd be the kind of guy who subtweets the Pope. He speaks of Britain like it's a rotting carcass. His words drip with disappointment. The Romans are gone, the Saxons are encroaching, and the island is full of leaders who worship wealth more than wisdom. For Gildas, Arthur probably would have just been another sinner with a sword. Not worth mentioning. Or worse, worth excluding on purpose to drive home the message that no earthly champion could save Britain without God. And here's the eerie part. Some of what he says still echoes. You walk the ruined churches, the broken Roman roads, the scattered stone crosses on windswept moors, and you can almost hear his voice in the wind. Not just a ranting monk, but someone watching his world fall apart in slow motion. He wasn't wrong about the collapse, he just never gave us a hero to hang on to, so you're left with silence, but a loaded France. Gildas's omission is one of the most talked about absences in medieval literature. It forces you to ask not just what's missing, but why. And that's what makes it so haunting, because silence in a world of legends is just as powerful as a song. As you leave Gildas's world, blinking in the dawn light of metaphorical 6th century despair, you realise something important. Maybe Arthur wasn't the kind of man you write about in sermons. Maybe he wasn't a saint. But maybe he did something great enough that later generations couldn't stop telling stories about him, even if Gildas didn't think he was worth a footnote. It's foggy, again, because in this version of Britain, it's always foggy. You're standing at the edge of a high ridge, boots sunk into the wet earth, and below you, just barely visible through the grey wash of morning mist, lies a field. Not a field of wheat or barley or picnic blankets, but one of blood. Mount Badon, or at least one of the several dozen places someone claims is Mount Badon. There are signs nearby saying Battle of Badon Hill, AD 500, with that painfully awkward question mark at the end, like even the signage is unsure. And that about sums up. This is the battle, the one everyone points to as Arthur's crowning moment of not being a myth. The fight where Britain stopped crumbling just long enough for someone to say, hey, we've got a shot. According to the tradition, Arthur faced off against a Saxon army so vast and terrifying it felt like the end of the world. And he won. Not barely, not tactically, decisively, the kind of win that buys you decades of peace, which, considering the state of things in post-Roman Britain, was basically a miracle. So let's get the basic legend out first. The battle, according to later sources, was fought near or at a place called Mons Badonicus, and Arthur not only participated, he led. And not only led, he annihilated. In Historia Brittonum, Arthur is said to have killed 960 men by himself, solo, like some prehistoric Rambo. The implication is that he was either a military genius, a demigod, or just very angry. Probably all three. Later Geoffrey of Monmouth and others pile on even more drama, turning Badon into the high point of Arthur's career, a moment of impossible heroism on a battlefield soaked in destiny. And here's the thing, Mount Badon very likely was real. Gildas talks about it. Remember him, our angry monk friend? He doesn't mention Arthur, still salty about that, but he does describe a massive victory that halted Saxon advances. So the battle itself probably happened. The real question is, where? And more importantly, who was actually there? Because here's where the fog thickens. Badon doesn't match any current place name directly. Over the years, historians have put forward at least a dozen locations. Bath, which used to be called Aquae Sulis, Salisbury Hill, Liddington Castle, even places in Wales. Each theory has a passionate fan base. Each comes with arguments about topography, ancient roads, Saxon movement patterns, and where a would-be warlord might have drawn a line in the mud and said, here, we stop them here. Bath is a favourite, mainly because it's got the Latin tie-in and some ancient military roads lead to it. It would have been a strategic location, close to Roman ruins, fortifiable, and within striking distance of major Saxon approaches. Plus, it has actual hills. And in Britain, if your battle doesn't happen on a hill, was it even worth telling a bard about? But even if we could find the exact spot, there's no archaeological evidence of a battle that fits the scale described. No mass graves, no sword piles, no dramatic chariot wheel half buried in the peat, just rolling hills, sheep and speculation, which means you're once again trying to reverse engineer history from a story someone told at a fire, possibly while drunk, possibly 200 years after the fact. That hasn't stopped people from trying. In fact, one of the most fascinating modern twists is how this battle has been used politically. Yes, even 1500 years later. In the 20th century, some writers saw Mount Badon as a metaphor for British resistance, a cultural stand against invaders. World War II propaganda even co-opted Arthurian imagery, casting Churchill as a modern-day Arthur figure. So if you're feeling like this whole myth has a legs well beyond its origin, you're not wrong. Badon became less about where and when, and more about what it meant. Here's your fringe fact of the night. One theory says the name Badon doesn't come from a place at all, but from a tribal name or a misunderstanding of another word. It might even be a corruption of Bath Hill or an earlier British term that's long since disappeared from the language. If that's true, we might be looking for a place that never existed, or that changed names so completely the battle is hiding in plain sight, like a ghost in Google Maps. And then comes the inevitable scholarly debate. Some believe that Arthur fought there and that Badon was his shining moment. Others say it was Ambrosius Aurelianus, another Romano-British leader whose name pops up in Gildas's writing. Some think Ambrosius and Arthur were the same person, with one name morphing into the other over time. That theory's thin on details but thick on imagination, which basically makes it Arthurian gold. Yet another camp argues that Badon wasn't one big battle, but a campaign, a series of skirmishes over months or years that were later compressed into a single mythic event. That would explain the lack of bodies and the inconsistencies in location. Think of it like a greatest hits compilation with all the boring parts edited out. It's not clean history, but it makes for better storytelling. Still, if Arthur was there, if even one man called Arthur helped hold the line, this is where his myth gets legs. A desperate defence, a bloodbath that turned the tide, a battle that kept the Saxons at bay long enough for future generations to dream of a golden age, even if it never really happened. You imagine the scene, the fog lifting just enough to see banners rippling in the wind, warriors bracing behind shields, the clash of iron and bone echoing across the hills, and at the centre of it all a figure, maybe a man, maybe a myth, swinging his blade like judgment itself. Maybe that's why we care so much about Badon. Because even if we don't know where it was, we need it to have happened. We need there to have been a moment, just once, where the tide was turned by courage and grit and a guy who didn't wait for someone else to save the island. So you stand in the mist a little longer, listening for hoofbeats that never come, wondering what it takes for a battle to become legend. The wind whispers no answers, just the silence of a field still holding secrets. You're seated now in a dark, smoky hall, not a grand medieval banquet room with shining goblets and choreographed lute music, but something rougher, more intimate. A big fire crackles in the centre pit, casting flickering shadows on the wood-planked walls. Around you sit men in wool cloaks, drinking from carved horn cups, scarred hands resting on sword hilts or gripping chunks of roasted meat. This, right here, might just be the real round table. No polished surface, no courtly elegance, just a circle, or close enough, of warriors who follow a leader, not because of noble titles or magic lineage, but because he's the only guy who hasn't gotten them all killed yet. The Round Table, as you probably know, is a late addition to the Arthurian mythos, a piece of narrative magic that pops up around the 12th century in the French romances. Supposedly built by Merlin himself, this circular marvel was meant to symbolise equality among Arthur's knights. No head, no foot, no higher or lower, everyone sits as equals. Very progressive for the Middle Ages, but if you peel back that fancy literary wallpaper, you might find something far older beneath, the Warrior Council. In Dark Age Britain, leaders didn't rule alone. They had to keep their fighting men close, loyal and well-fed, or face mutiny. These warbands were tight-knit groups, often made up of relatives, childhood friends and hardened mercenaries. Loyalty was everything. A leader needed charisma, strategy and above all victory. You didn't keep followers by inspiring poetry, you kept them by keeping them alive. So now you're imagining Arthur, whatever name he actually went by, holding court not at Camelot but in a hill-fort longhouse. He's leaning forward on a carved stool, hair damp with rain, voice low and gritty as he lays out the next move against the Saxons. His warriors grunt their assent or push back with blunt advice. Maybe one of them, future Lancelot, future Gawain, challenges him. Not out of disrespect, but because he can. That's what real loyalty looks like, not flattery. Honest debate around a fire. This model of warrior leadership appears across Celtic and Germanic cultures. The early Welsh tales describe Teulu, a kind of warband family structure, with the leader at the centre not just militarily, but socially. These men fought with him, lived with him, and died with him. If you want a round table, this is probably where it starts. Not in a castle hall, but in muddy boots, shared blood, and mutual trust. The shape of the table, a metaphor. Equality wasn't in the geometry, it was in the bond. And here's something strange but real. Some scholars believe the idea of the round table may have roots in ancient Celtic feasting rituals. These were gatherings where status was fluid, determined by deeds rather than birth. The greatest warrior got the best cut of meat, the first cup of mead, not because he owned land, but because he'd just taken a spear to the gut and kept fighting. Picture a room where stories of glory and failure were passed around with the dishes, and where honour meant more than title. Sound familiar? Of course, once the legend machine kicked in, things changed. By the time Chrétien de Troyes and the other Romance writers started playing with the Arthur myth, the Round Table became something altogether fancier. Polished wood, ceremonial meetings, quests handed out like job assignments. Everyone impeccably dressed, speaking in flowery phrases, and occasionally pausing to kiss a goblet or drop to one knee. This version isn't bad, it's just not the original. And not everyone bought into it, even back then. In some later medieval text, the Round Table starts to fracture. Knights bicker. Some defect. Lancelot sleeps with Guinevere, and half the group starts swinging swords at the other half. So even in fiction, the Round Table was a fragile dream. A circle can't keep people from tearing each other apart if loyalty crumbles. Now here's a deliciously fringe theory to toss on your plate. Some believe that the idea of the Round Table may have been borrowed, or at least influenced, by stories from ancient Persia and the East. In those traditions, legendary kings would meet with advisors or warriors in circles to symbolise justice and unity. It's possible the idea travelled through oral trade routes mixing with Christian motifs and landed smack in the middle of Arthurian lore. Historical game of telephone, anyone? But most scholars settle on this. The Round Table is an evolution of the tribal warrior circle. It grew fancier over time because the audiences grew fancier. As medieval society got more hierarchical, people wanted their myths to reflect that, but still hold on to the dream of equality. Arthur's court became the ideal. Noble men sitting side by side, not out of social status, but merit. It was aspirational, and like most things that aspire too high, it was also fiction. Still, there's something moving about the idea. Even now, the Round Table resonates. How many times have you heard people reference it in boardrooms, or D&D campaigns, or start-up brainstorm sessions? It's the fantasy of the perfect team. No egos, just shared purpose. And maybe, just maybe, that fantasy grew from something real. A half-remembered campfire on a cold hilltop, where men who trusted each other circled close and planned how to survive another winter. So picture that fire again. Hear the wet crackle of logs, the low murmur of strategy, the occasional cough or bark of laughter. Arthur is there, not with a crown but a leather tunic and a bloodied blade resting at his feet. His men aren't polished. They're exhausted, loyal, human, and together they form a circle. Not perfect, not mystical, but real. That might be the most believable Arthurian image yet. You step away from the circle of warriors and into a quieter room, a smaller fire burning low, its flames dancing off worn stone and threadbare tapestry. The voices are hushed here, more careful, because this is where the story turns personal, where myth becomes marriage, and love, loyalty and betrayal start to wrap themselves around the legend like vines on old masonry. Tonight, you meet Guinevere, or Gwen Hwyfar, if you want her pre-French, pre-Disney, pre-courtly love name, queen consort, alleged traitor, occasional nun, and all-around mystery. What we know for certain? Almost nothing. Guinevere, like Arthur, shows up late to the written party. She doesn't appear in any of the earliest historical mentions of Arthur. Not in Gildas, not in Nennius, not even in the Annales Cambria. Her first major appearance comes centuries later, when the Arthurian legend is already blossoming into something fancier, more romantic and much more French. Thanks, Chrétien de Troyes. In those early stories she's already complicated. Sometimes a loyal queen, sometimes a tragic pawn, sometimes the reason Camelot collapses. It all depends on who's telling the tale, and what kind of moral they're trying to squeeze out of her. But if you reach further back, before the lacy gowns and forbidden kisses, you might glimpse a different woman. One who wasn't just someone's wife, but a queen in her own right. A political player. Maybe even a symbol. Let's rewind to the name, Gwen Hwyfar. It's Welsh. The etymology is murky but fascinating. Some think it means white phantom or fair one, which sounds dreamy, yes, but also eerie, like she's more of a presence than Sarmatian a person. Others link her name to older Celtic goddesses of sovereignty, divine women who didn't just marry kings but made them. In that tradition, a queen wasn't just ornamental, she was the land incarnate, the connection between the king and the earth, which means Guinevere might not have been written as a love interest at all. She could have been a political metaphor from the very start. Now picture this, a strong-willed queen bound to Arthur not just by affection, but by necessity. Their marriage, whether arranged or chosen, is a power move, uniting clans, sealing alliances, legitimizing rule. She's not draped on a velvet cushion sighing at sunsets. She's walking the halls of a timber fortress, negotiating with warriors, possibly leading her own small retinue. And like many women of her time, her influence lives between the lines of male-written history. But of course things get messier later on. The most famous version of Guinevere, the one tangled up with Lancelot, is a 12th century invention. In the French romances, she's elevated to queenly elegance and shoved into a tragic triangle with two men who apparently never learn to communicate. This version paints her as torn, tempted, and ultimately destructive. She falls for Lancelot, cheats on Arthur, and brings down the utopia that was Camelot. Some writers make her remorseful, others condemn her completely, and more than a few reduce her to a cautionary tale about women and power. Here's where things split down weirdly modern lines. Some see her as a feminist icon, one of the few female characters in medieval literature with real agency. She chooses, she loves, she rebels. Others see her as the scapegoat of an anxious male society, used to explain why great things fall apart, not because of war or politics, but because of women, because of desire, because, of course, it couldn't be the men who ruined everything. And that's the scholarly debate still rolling on today. Was Guinevere a villain or a victim, a traitor or a trapped queen? Or was she something more mythic, an echo of an older archetype, reshaped by centuries of moral storytelling? You've got academic papers on both sides. Some dig into the sovereignty goddess angle, arguing that Guinevere was originally a kind of personified Britain, meant to pass between kings as political power shifted. Others trace her transformation through literature, showing how every new writer added a fresh layer of judgment or redemption, depending on their culture's views on women. Here's your fringe fact cherry on top. In some Welsh tales, there are multiple Guineveres. Not clones, successive queens, each named Gwenhwyfar, each with their own rise and fall. This could be a narrative device, or it might be a reflection of oral traditions blending and repeating. Or, and this is the fun part, maybe it's a hint that Guinevere was never meant to be one woman, but a recurring symbol of power, transition, and yes, betrayal. There's even a late medieval legend where Guinevere ends her days in a convent, weeping for her sins and refusing Arthur's ghost when he comes to claim her. That image, of a queen alone in stone corridors haunted by choices she never fully controlled, says more about the culture that created it than the woman herself. Repentance becomes the final punctuation mark, because a woman who exercised her will must apparently end in silence. But walk it back. Go back to the early days, to the fortress halls and the smoky hearth, to a time when alliances were forged over blood oaths and mead cups, and the woman beside the leader was just as strategic, just as fierce, just as important. Maybe she wasn't beautiful in the way the French poets imagined. Maybe she was weathered, sharp-tongued, always watching. A queen not made of glass but of iron and grit. Not Arthur's downfall but his partner and maybe even his superior in more ways than history allowed. So you let the fire burn low, imagining her seated beside Arthur, not behind him. Her hand steady, her gaze sharper than most of the swords in the room. A woman born into a brutal world, navigating love, power and survival with the only tools she was given. She doesn't need to be perfect, she just needs to have been possible. The air turns thick now, not with smoke or blood this time, but with something stranger, older. You feel it before you see anything. That tingle at the base of your neck, the way the shadows in the forest seem to stretch just a little too far, the hum of something you can't quite name pressing against your ears like a forgotten spell. Welcome to the part of the legend where logic quietly exits stage left, and the weirdness rolls in, stage centre. Tonight you meet Merlin, or at least the raw, tangled roots of whatever eventually became Merlin. Spoiler, he doesn't have a pointy hat. In fact, the Merlin of the earliest stories is closer to a broken prophet than a wise old wizard. No staff, no smoke bombs, no cheerful advice followed by vague disappearances. You find him instead deep in the woods, filthy, muttering to birds, possibly naked. Yeah, that kind of weird. The earliest source to give us something like a Merlin is the Welsh poem cycle about a figure named Myrddin Wyllt. Myrddin the Wild. According to the story, he was a bard who went mad after witnessing a horrific battle, fled into the forest and gained the ability to see the future. So more traumatized hermit than magical advisor, but it's a start. Mervyn appears in fragments, short poems, wild ramblings, sometimes philosophical, sometimes barely coherent. He predicts things, he rants against kings, he talks to animals, he sees visions of war and ruin, and it's all very raw. You get the sense of a man who's not just trying to explain the world, but survive it. He doesn't wave his hands and fix things, he shouts warnings no one listens to, think less Gandalf. More forest conspiracy theorist with occasional moments of unsettling clarity. So how did that guy become this guy? The Merlin, you know, the one standing calmly beside Arthur in white robes and radiating wise grandpa energy. Enter Geoffrey of Monmouth, the 12th century literary alchemist who decided to scoop up these fragmented wildman stories, mix them with Christian theology and political needs, and pour them into the mould of a proper character. In his Historia Regum Britanniae, that wildly influential fake history book we'll roast in detail later, Geoffrey introduces a figure named Merlinus Ambrosius, a mashup of Mervyn and Ambrosius Aurelianus, 2 men, 1 wizard, very efficient. Geoffrey's Merlin is a child prophet, born of a nun and an incubus, yep, a literal demon, which makes him half mortal, half supernatural. As a child, he shocks everyone by accurately predicting the collapse of towers built on unstable foundations, one of which houses, apparently, 2 battling dragons, red and white, symbolising the struggle between Britons and Saxons. It's a lot, and it marks the start of Merlin as a supernatural mouthpiece for fate and political allegory. From here, the Merlin myth evolves quickly. He becomes a kingmaker, a schemer, and the man who orchestrates Arthur's conception. Remember that awkward moment at Tintagel where Uther Pendragon magically disguises himself to seduce Igraine? Yeah, Merlin made that happen. That's his thing now, shaping destiny, often in ethically questionable ways. But this version isn't just plucked from thin air, he's built from layers. Geoffrey pulled from Welsh oral tradition, Latin Christian writings, and probably a healthy dose of his own imagination. Over time, French writers added to it, making Merlin older, wiser, more mysterious. He gets robes, staffs, crystal balls, and a whole air of solemn mystery. By the time Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur comes around in the 15th century, Merlin is practically the Arthurian Siri. Ask him anything and he'll tell you the future while stroking his beard. Now here's the scholarly twist that keeps people arguing over wine. Was Merlin ever based on a real person? There's no consensus. Some suggest the Merlin figure was inspired by a historical bard traumatised by war. Others think he's a symbolic echo of the old druidic priesthood. Men who claimed insight, who advised kings, and who may have preserved oral histories and ritual knowledge long after Rome tried to wipe them out. There's even a theory that Merlin was a composite, part bard, part sage, part disgruntled political advisor whose name stuck like moss on a stone. And then there's the fringe fact favourite. Merlin might have been invented, or heavily repackaged, as a piece of political propaganda. Geoffrey of Monmouth wasn't just writing bedtime stories. He had a purpose. By creating a magical advisor who foretold the rise and fall of British kings, he gave legitimacy to certain royal lines, wrapped in mythic grandeur. Merlin wasn't just magic, he was messaging. A way to claim divine or mystical right to rule. But let's not lose track of the feeling. You're still sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, and you think about that man in the forest, the mad prophet, the dreamer no one listened to. Maybe he wasn't magical. Maybe he was just the one person who saw how things were unravelling and couldn't bear it. Maybe Merlin was never meant to be a spellcaster, but a warning. A voice in the wild trying to keep the old world from collapsing entirely. You imagine him now, not conjuring fireballs or hatching riddles, but standing at the edge of a battlefield trembling, eyes wide, whispering prophecies that sound too strange to be true, until they are. Maybe Arthur didn't trust him because of magic, but because he saw the world differently, and maybe that's enough. Because when you strip away the flair and the special effects, Merlin is something all legends need. A witness. Someone who remembers what came before and tries, in their own broken way, to guide what comes next. Whether he was a man, a myth, or a political invention, he still sits quietly in the corner of the Arthurian world, watching, warning, and waiting for the end he already saw coming. So here you are, sitting in the shadow of a castle that hasn't been built yet, watching a very famous knight strut into the story like he owns the place. His name? Lancelot. And no, he was not in the original cast. He didn't ride out from a foggy fortress with Arthur's earliest warband. He wasn't a whisper in the oldest Welsh poems. He wasn't even a thought in Geoffrey of Monmouth's very creative head. He arrived late, like fashionably late, sweeping in from the French side of things like a brooding foreign exchange student who immediately ruins the group project with his charm and perfect cheekbones. You could argue that Lancelot is one of the most successful insertions in literary history. He doesn't just appear in the Arthurian world, he crashes into it, takes up permanent residence, and then blows it up from the inside. And all of that begins around the 12th century, courtesy of Chrétien de Troyes, the same guy who gave Guinevere her drama arc and turned Arthur's hard-edged legend into courtly fanfiction. Now here's the twist, Lancelot wasn't even supposed to be the main attraction. In Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, Chrétien sets out to explore the theme of chivalric love, and Lancelot is basically a tool to do that. But then something strange happens. Readers love him, like, really love him. Suddenly he's everywhere. Arthur's favourite knight, the best swordsman in the land, so noble, so pure, and also totally in love with Arthur's wife. Oops. And that's where things spiral, because if you've ever wondered how a legendary utopian kingdom like Camelot could fall apart, Lancelot is the catalyst. Not an invading army, not political failure, not a cursed artifact, just one very talented man with bad timing and worse boundaries. It's kind of poetic in the worst way. Here's the uncomfortable truth of it. Before Lancelot, Arthurian stories had conflict, sure, but they didn't have this kind of betrayal. The kind that turns friends into enemies, lovers into traitors, and an idealistic round table into a pile of splintered chairs. Lancelot introduces the human drama, infidelity, honour, guilt, that turns the myth from legend into tragedy, and once that thread is pulled, the rest of the tapestry starts to unravel. Camelot was never the same, and now you get to wonder, was Lancelot based on a real person? Probably not. He's a literary invention from head to toe, but that doesn't mean he came from nowhere. Some believe Chrétien was inspired by Celtic stories of warrior champions, especially ones with complicated personal lives. Others think Lancelot is a perfect example of cultural remixing, a knight who embodies Christian chivalry layered onto pagan roots, wrapped in French sophistication, and dropped into a British myth like a perfume bottle in a mud pit. His full name, by the way, is often rendered Lancelot du Lac, Lancelot of the Lake. That detail isn't just aesthetic, it ties him to the Lady of the Lake, a mystical figure who raises him from childhood. You get this semi-magical orphaned origin story that makes him sound more like a demigod than a knight, and that's no accident. The stories need him to be special, exceptional enough to rival Arthur, both in virtue and in love. If Arthur is the sun, Lancelot is the moon, cool, reflective, and always just out of reach. But that whole perfect knight thing? Yeah, it's complicated. Because Lancelot is flawed, deeply. He breaks oaths, he lies. He lets his personal desires override his loyalty to Arthur, and yet he's often portrayed as the most noble of all the knights. The contradiction is baked into his character. He's the kind of guy who delivers tearful apologies with blood on his sword. A walking morality puzzle. And scholars love puzzles. Some argue Lancelot represents the tension between personal virtue and public duty, a perfect embodiment of the failure of chivalry. Others say he's a French answer to Arthur himself, a way of importing glamour and passion into a story that originally centred on unity and grit. There's even a theory that he was created to appeal to aristocratic women who wanted to see more romance and less battlefield grunting in their epic tales. And hey, it worked. But Lancelot doesn't exist in isolation. His presence warps the entire story. The affair with Guinevere fractures the Round Table. Knights take sides. Arthur is torn between justice and mercy. The once unbreakable brotherhood dissolves into civil war. And just like that, the dream ends not with a dragon or a foreign invasion, but with betrayal from within. It's Shakespearean long before Shakespeare shows up. Here's your fringe tidbit for the night. Some fringe theorists believe Lancelot was modelled after a real knight whose identity was erased, or who was written over deliberately for political reasons. The idea is that his story reflects too many real-world aristocratic scandals from the French courts to be pure invention. There's no proof, of course. But if you want to believe that Lancelot's tale is rooted in real juicy medieval gossip, I won't stop you. And what about Arthur? The introduction of Lancelot changes him too. In the older tales, Arthur is central, brave, commanding, slightly terrifying. But in the courtly romances, he becomes more passive, more background. Lancelot takes the spotlight, and Arthur becomes a kind of weary king, noble but ineffective, watching his kingdom crumble while trying to keep his dignity intact. It's tragic, really. The warrior becomes a cuckolded bureaucrat. The centre of the story slowly drifts off-centre. You sit back now, letting all this settle. Lancelot, the interloper, the ideal, the downfall. He was never meant to be real. He wasn't carved into ancient stone or whispered about by monks. He was written into the story to fill a role. And like so many parts of Arthurian myth, that role grew into something much larger, much messier, and impossible to ignore. In the end, Lancelot didn't destroy Camelot. Not directly, but he cracked it, showed that even in a world of perfect swords and noble ideals, human weakness in war still finds a way in. Maybe that's why he resonates. Because we don't just remember the kings who built great kingdoms, we remember the ones who broke them too. You're waist deep in a lake now, not literally, but mentally, which is probably safer. The water is cool and still, green-tinged under the weight of centuries of legend. Ripples lap at invisible shores. Somewhere below the surface, a sword is waiting, not just any sword. The sword. Excalibur. Or maybe not Excalibur. Maybe it's something else entirely. Because here's the thing most people don't realise. The story of Arthur's sword is a complete mess. A glorious, confusing, absolutely contradictory mess that's somehow turned into the most iconic weapon in Western myth. Let's start with the basics, or what should be the basics but aren't. In some stories, Arthur pulls the sword from a stone. That's the Excalibur we all think we know, the one that proves his right to rule, the sword only the true king can draw. In other versions, Excalibur isn't from a stone at all. It's given to Arthur by a mysterious enchantress from a lake, and in some tellings those are two completely different swords. Yeah, two Excaliburs, maybe. This weird divide starts cropping up once the French get involved. Early on, especially in the works of Geoffrey of Monmouth and Welsh legend, there's just one sword, Caldfulch, which roughly translates to hard breach or battle breach in Welsh. Pretty metal. That's Arthur's original blade. Later Latin translations soften it to Caliburnus, and then the French writers twist that into Excalibur. So far so good. But then Chrétien de Troyes and his literary buddies start adding flair. Suddenly there's a mystical lady of the lake. She rises from the depths, hand wrapped in silk, and offers a sword to Arthur, like she's passing him a cosmic lightsaber. And just like that, we get another origin story. One with more sparkle, less anvil, more ambience. The sword in the stone starts to fade in some traditions, or gets rebranded as a separate earlier blade. Arthur pulls it, proves his worth, then breaks it in battle, and then gets Excalibur from the lake. A kind of two-step process. Demo sword, then upgrade. Comme geishas, now you're sitting in the middle of this contradiction and you're not alone. Scholars have wrestled with this for ages. Was the sword in the stone Excalibur? Or was that a different blade altogether? Some argue the sword in the stone moment is symbolic, an invention to give Arthur a divine seal of approval, a literal manifestation of destiny. Others say the lake sword is the real Excalibur, and the stone sword is just for show. Then there's the legend of Excalibur's magical properties. Some versions say it was unbreakable, others say it could cut through anything, even steel. In a few tellings, the sword itself isn't magical at all, but its scabbard is. Yeah, the boring bit. According to some stories, the scabbard prevents the wearer from bleeding, making Arthur nearly invincible. Which is a cool twist, until you learn that in some versions, Morgan Le Fay, Arthur's sometimes sister, sometimes enemy, steals the scabbard and tosses it into a lake, which makes you wonder why Arthur didn't just tie that thing to his leg with a chain. And let's not forget the most cinematic part of the whole sword saga, its end. Arthur, mortally wounded at the Battle of Camlan, tells one of his knights, usually Bedivere, to return Excalibur to the lake. Bedivere fumbles the job a couple times, because he understandably doesn't want to chuck a priceless artifact into a pond, but eventually obeys. The lady's hand rises again, catches the sword and sinks back beneath the water. A full circle moment. The blade returns to the mystery it came from. It's beautiful, it's haunting. It also makes zero logistical sense. but we're not here for realism. Here's a wild fringe fact for your bedtime brain. There's a theory that the whole Lady of the Lake story evolved from older Celtic lake rituals. In some ancient Celtic traditions, warriors would offer weapons to lakes or rivers as gifts to the gods, especially after a battle. Archaeologists have found swords deliberately bent or broken and thrown into bodies of water across Britain and northern Europe. So the image of a hand emerging from the water may not be just myth. It might be an echo of a very real, very ritualistic practice. And that's the part that always gets under your skin, the image of the sword beneath the water. The idea that power isn't just seized, it's granted. That the greatest weapon isn't stolen from your enemies, but bestowed by something deeper, older, and maybe not fully understood. That's what the lake represents. Not just magic, but mystery. The unknown force that chooses a champion, not because he's strong, but because he's needed. Of course, modern retellings tend to pick and choose. Some keep the stone, some keep the lake, some mash them together like a mythological smoothie. Disney goes with the stone. The Mists of Avalon leans hard on the lake. Monty Python mocks both, obviously, but in every version, Excalibur becomes more than a weapon. It's Arthur's soul, his destiny in steel, and eventually the weight he can't carry anymore. Here's the kicker. In all these legends, Arthur never passes Excalibur on. He doesn't train a successor. He doesn't leave the sword for the next king. He returns it to the lake, to silence, to myth, because maybe that's where it always belonged. The sword that was never his to keep, only to wield for a while. You sit now at the lake's edge, toes just brushing the water, and imagine it resting there beneath the surface, waiting. Not for another king maybe, but for another story. Another moment when someone will need to believe that power can be earned, not taken. That justice might still rise blade first from the deep. Now picture yourself wrapped in a threadbare cloak, standing on the edge of a damp, wind-lashed cliff overlooking a rocky coastline. The sea below crashes against the stone like it's trying to erase the island altogether. Behind you, shadowy hills, scattered villages, maybe a few crumbling Roman walls that haven't quite given up yet. Ahead, the yawning mouth of the unknown. Saxons, warlords, betrayal. But here's the thing, tonight Arthur isn't just a king, he's a rebel, a fighter, maybe even a revolutionary. Because there's a version of the story where Arthur isn't a monarch at all, but something far more dangerous, Celtic freedom fighter. Let's be clear, this isn't the Arthur of courtly love and polite tournaments. This is the Arthur. With mud on his boots, a cloak made from wolf fur, and a grim smile carved into his face by years of bitter war. A guerrilla leader. A tactical genius with no patience for ceremony, and every reason to hate what's coming over the eastern horizon. Because from this perspective, the Saxons aren't just invaders. They're the final nail in the coffin of native Britain. And Arthur? Arthur is the man who says, not yet. This idea, that Arthur was the last great Celtic resistance leader, has been floating around for a long time. It shows up in whispers in Welsh poetry, in the margins of old maps, in the hearts of nationalists from Cornwall to Scotland. In this version of the story, Arthur doesn't inherit a throne. He earns his reputation one bloody ambush at a time. He's not protecting Camelot. He's defending everything that hasn't yet been stripped away. Some scholars believe that if Arthur existed, he was probably a Romano-British commander rallying what was left of the native population against the encroaching Germanic tribes. But others suggest something even more radical, that he wasn't Romanized at all, that he came from the Celtic strongholds of the West, untouched by Latin schooling, born into a world that had never truly submitted to the Empire. If that's true, then Arthur wasn't trying to restore order. He was trying to preserve identity, Celtic language, culture, myth, and land. Think less King of the Britons, more Che Guevara with a broadsword. And here's where it gets wild. In some of the oldest surviving Welsh texts, especially the poetry attributed to bards like Taliesin, Arthur isn't noble. He's feral. He's a warrior who hunts giants, who wields supernatural strength, who leads wild charges against overwhelming odds and sometimes disappears into mist, only to return when he's needed most. This is Arthur, as mythic hero, yes, but also as resistance, a symbol for the people left behind. One poem even suggests Arthur had the power of a god, or was descended from one. He fights monsters, he slays witches, he stands as the lone figure against a tidal wave of change. This Arthur isn't romantic. He's not even always good. He's terrifying. And that's the point. Because sometimes what a culture needs isn't a saint, it's a hammer. You see this Arthur again in the Historia Brittonum, where he's called a dux bellorum, a war leader, not a king. He leads, but he doesn't rule. He fights, but he doesn't sit on a throne. In this framing, Arthur is more of a rallying point than a politician, a figure that fragmented tribes can gather around when everything else is falling apart. He doesn't write laws, he makes battle plans. And here's the fringe fact of the night. In some fringe nationalist histories, particularly in 19th and 20th century Wales, Arthur is painted as the last true Briton, a pre-Saxon, pre-Norman, pre-everything figure who stands for cultural purity. These interpretations are heavily romanticised, sometimes a little cringy, and definitely loaded with political baggage. But the core idea is interesting, that Arthur represents a version of Britain that might have been, if only the invaders had been stopped. Of course there are debates. Many scholars warn against projecting modern nationalist ideals onto a figure who probably wouldn't recognise half of what we think he stood for. They caution that the Celtic freedom fighter idea is more invention than reality, a mirror we hold up to our own hopes and anxieties. Fair enough, but still there's something in the old stories, in the way Arthur keeps popping up in places he's not supposed to, in how he never quite dies, but instead slips into the hills, waiting. You walk the misty moors now, boots crunching over stone and heather, and imagine this rebel king. Maybe he's not regal. Maybe he's wearing a wolf pelt over a battered tunic, sword slung low, always moving. His warriors aren't knights, they're hunters, ex-farmers, old Roman auxiliaries who refuse to fade quietly into Saxon England. They raid supply lines, they trap invaders in narrow passes, they fight not because they believe in empire, but because they believe in home. And when he dies, if he dies, there's no golden bier, no elegy sung by angelic choirs. Maybe he falls on a nameless field, alongside the last of his men. Maybe he disappears into the forest and becomes a story. Or maybe, like so many legends, he lives on in fragments, carved into rock, whispered in storms, written into the soul of a culture that refuses to be erased. Because even if Arthur wasn't real, not as a single man anyway, the need for him was. When everything fell apart, people needed a name to hang their courage on. A story to remind them they weren't done fighting, a face to wear the mask of survival. So here he stands, sword in hand, cloak snapping in the wind, eyes fixed on the rising sun over a broken land. Not a king, not a saint. Just a warrior who said, "You don't get to take this, not yet." The path narrows as you move west, past the comfortable fields of later England, past the influence of Rome, into the ancient craggy heartlands where mist clings to every hill and the roads turn into sheep trails. You're in Wales now, proper Arthur country if you ask any local bard worth their salt. The air feels older here, full of rain and memory. This is where the story changes again, shedding its French lace and English politics to become something rawer, fiercer and, honestly, a lot weirder. Because in the earliest Welsh stories, Arthur isn't a polished king at all. He's a force of nature, a monster slayer, a war chieftain with a mean streak and a very high body count. Let's get this out of the way. Welsh Arthur is not cuddly. You don't want to invite him to a wedding. You definitely don't want to be on the wrong side of a cattle raid when he's around. He shows up in early poems like Ny Gododin and the Black Book of Carmarthen as this almost mythic presence. Half man, half storm cloud, always on the edge of something violent. He hunts, he raids, he kills giants, he steals cauldrons from the underworld, and somehow he still ends up being remembered as a hero. In Culhwch and Olwen, one of the oldest Arthurian stories in Welsh tradition, Arthur leads a wild, chaotic group of warriors on a quest that makes very little logistical sense, and somehow involves about a dozen mythic tasks, including retrieving a magical razor from a boar named Torc Traeth. This boar, by the way, is not just big, it's intelligent, vengeful, and may or may not have diplomatic immunity depending on which translation you read. It's like the Odyssey with more fur and less logic. And Arthur? He doesn't even blink. He gathers his crew, guys with names like Bedwyr, Cai and Gwalchmai, and charges headfirst into these quests, like a man who either can't die or just doesn't care. There's no shining armour here. No round table, just adrenaline and the scent of pine sap. In these tales, Arthur is more of a Celtic Hercules than a king. He's not leading an orderly kingdom, he's leading a war party with supernatural side missions. It's glorious chaos. What's fascinating about these Welsh sources is how old they feel. They don't care about moral lessons or polished dialogue. They care about deeds, about epic feats, about being remembered. Arthur is defined not by virtue, but by velocity. How hard he hits, how far he rides, how many heads he takes home in a sack. And that's what makes him compelling here. He's not sanitized, he's alive. There's one early Welsh poem that calls him the Red Reaper of Men, which sounds like something you'd stencil on the side of a fighter jet, not assigned to a mythic monarch. In another, he's credited with slaying more enemies than any other living soul. And yes, this includes regular battles, magical beasts, and at least one giant with a bad attitude and a fondness for abducting people. It's not clear whether these tales are meant to be metaphor, memory, or just the Celtic version of blockbuster cinema, but they leave a mark. Now, let's talk about the company he keeps in these stories. His companions are weird, delightfully so. One can grow as tall as a tree at will, one has a third eye in the middle of his forehead, another is so fast that sparks fly from his feet when he runs. It's not just Arthur who's superhuman, it's the whole squad. They read less like knights and more like mutants or demigods. It's like if the Avengers got lost in the Cambrian mountains and decided to hunt magical deer instead of saving New York. And here's your fringe fact. Some scholars believe that Arthur, in these stories, may not have even been a real man, but a repurposed god. A faded deity from Celtic mythology, rebranded as a hero once Christianity started to mop up the old pantheon. That would explain the inhuman feats, the giant killing resume, and the complete disregard for historical geography. If true, Arthur didn't become mythic. He started there, only later being squeezed into the mould of a mortal warrior. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some historians argue that the Welsh Arthur stories are simply poetic exaggerations of a real war leader's deeds, that in the oral tradition, every victory got a little bigger, every sword swing a little flashier, until the man turned into a legend too massive to fact-check. Others believe these tales preserve the vibe of Arthur more than the man, showing us how he was remembered by the people who claimed him first. What's most striking, though, is how local he feels here. This isn't the Arthur of Empire, or of Romantic France. This is a tribal Arthur, a man of the valleys and highlands, the guy who knows which river crossings flood in spring and which hilltop forts give the best view of an approaching army. There's no courtly polish here, just bone and mud and fury. You walk now through the rain, following a sheep path lined with stones older than your ancestors, and you realise something. The Welsh didn't need Arthur to be perfect. They needed him to be powerful, terrible even, a shield against the night, a myth you could chant before battle to keep your hands from shaking. And whether or not he was real, he served that purpose. So forget Camelot for a second, forget round tables and holy grails. Think instead of a cold, damp cave high in the mountains, where a fire burns low and men huddle close, trading stories about the time Arthur hunted the great boar, or tore through 50 Saxons before breakfast. He's not there, but his sword hangs heavy in the air. His name still echoes off the stone, and the monsters of the forest, whatever form they take, still hesitate at the sound of it. You're in a monastery now, no grand cathedral, just a solid little stone building hunched against the weather, like it's trying not to draw attention to itself. Inside there's the scratching of a quill on parchment, the smell of wax and ink, and the unmistakable vibe of someone making things up with absolute confidence. Sitting at the centre of this literary storm is one Geoffrey of Monmouth, a 12th century cleric with a pen in one hand and an entire nation's mythology in the other, and tonight you watch as he flips the Arthurian legend on its head and somehow convinces the entire medieval world that his version is the one that matters. Let's just say it. Geoffrey was a historical chaos agent. His most famous work, Historia Regum Britanniae, The History of the Kings of Britain, is the medieval equivalent of a blockbuster reboot. Part fiction, part fanfic, all ambition, he claimed it was based on an ancient book in the British tongue, given to him by a mysterious source, which, let's be honest, sounds like something Indiana Jones would mumble while dodging arrows. No one has ever seen this ancient book. Scholars have a strong hunch it never existed, but Geoffrey wasn't about to let a little thing like facts get in the way of a good narrative. And wow, what a narrative. Geoffrey takes scraps of Welsh legend, a few Latin chronicles, some vague biblical echoes, and builds an entire royal lineage stretching from Brutus of Troy all the way to Arthur. Yes, that Brutus, from the Trojan War. According to Geoffrey, the Britons are descended from Trojan refugees who sailed west and founded a new kingdom. Because why not give Britain the same mythic pedigree as Rome? When it comes to Arthur, Geoffrey doesn't hold back. He goes full Hollywood. His Arthur isn't just a war leader, he's a world-conquering super king. This Arthur defeats the Saxons, yes, but he doesn't stop there. He crosses into Europe, defeats the Romans, conquers Gaul and prepares to take on the emperor himself before being betrayed by Mordred back home. It's part historical epic, part political wish fulfillment, and all wildly entertaining. But there's something strategic going on beneath the drama. Geoffrey was writing during a time when the Normans, descendants of Viking invaders who had settled in France, were consolidating their power in Britain. They needed a story. A reason why they, of all people, had the right to rule this stormy little island. Geoffrey gave them that story. He turned the Britons into a noble people with a glorious past, and Arthur into the ultimate king. Brave, wise, undefeatable, and most importantly just. This Arthur wasn't scrappy. He wasn't muddy or blood-spattered or barking orders across a campfire. He was regal. He sat on thrones and wore crowns and delivered stirring speeches before decisive battles. Geoffrey invented a Camelot-shaped space for later writers to fill in. He didn't use the name Camelot himself, but he might as well have drawn a chalk outline around it. Here's your quirky fact of the night. Geoffrey also gave us Merlin as we mostly recognise him. He combined earlier stories of the mad prophet Mervyn with a Roman-sounding name and created Merlinus Ambrosius, a wizard prophet political fixer who could drop truth bombs and predict your downfall before breakfast. He's also the guy who engineers Arthur's birth by arranging a magically disguised seduction, which frankly is a pretty twisted way to start a hero's journey, but Geoffrey never let ethics get in the way of narrative flow. And now for the academic controversy, because Geoffrey drives historians up the wall. His book was treated for centuries as legitimate history, even though it's basically 12th century fan fiction. It shaped the way people thought about British history for generations. Monks copied it into manuscripts. Chroniclers cited it. Kings used it for propaganda. It was the medieval equivalent of Wikipedia. Widely read, wildly unreliable, and impossible to escape. Many modern scholars see Geoffrey as a propagandist in clerical robes. He wasn't trying to document history, he was trying to build it. His Arthur isn't a reflection of the past, it's a mirror held up to the present, a political tool, a morale booster, a what-if scenario designed to inspire and justify. Others, more generously, see Geoffrey as a literary genius who knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't deceiving people, he was telling the kind of story they wanted, needed to hear. After centuries of invasions, fragmentation and chaos, Britain craved a hero. Geoffrey gave them one big enough to eclipse all others, and then he wrote it in Latin, the language of the educated elite, ensuring it would spread like wildfire across Europe's monasteries and courts. And spread it did. His Arthur lit a fuse. French poets picked it up and ran with it, adding chivalry, love triangles, and magic. Later English writers expanded the mythology into something almost religious, and all of it, every castle, every grail quest, every knightly vow, grew out of the garden Geoffrey planted. But the irony, in giving Arthur to the world, Geoffrey may have buried the original. If there was ever a real Arthur, a war leader, a tribal chieftain, a freedom fighter, he's long gone by this point in the story. Geoffrey's version is so grand, so all-consuming that it steamrolls the older, messier traditions. The muddy warrior becomes a marble statue. The battle-hardened chieftain becomes a king who dines with emperors and wears gold plate armour that somehow doesn't chafe. And maybe that's the price of legend. You become larger than life, but you lose your face. You become a symbol, cleaner, shinier, easier to print on flags and shields. But the man, if he ever lived, fades. You sit now in that chilly stone room, the scratch of Geoffrey's quill echoing off the walls, and you wonder, was he building a myth, or writing an obituary for the truth? By now, the Arthurian story has more layers than a medieval onion pie. Myth wrapped in legend, wrapped in politics, sprinkled with just enough theology to make it sparkle in candlelight. So naturally, the next chapter takes us into territory that's both sacred and absurd, holy and head-scratchingly convoluted. Tonight, you go questing. Not for dragons or damsels, but for something far slipperier. The Holy Grail. The cup that launched 1,000 knights and even more metaphors. Let's start with the obvious. The Holy Grail is not in the original Arthurian stories, not even close. It arrives late, shoved into the narrative like a surprise guest no one invited, but somehow ends up taking over the whole party. Its first literary appearance happens in the late 12th century, in a French romance by, who else? Chrétien de Troyes, the same guy who gave us Lancelot and most of the Round Table's emotional baggage. His unfinished poem, Percival, or The Story of the Grail, introduces the concept of a mysterious glowing vessel that passes by silently in a spooky procession. No one knows what it is, no one explains it, but it's clearly important, and the knight Percival, being as dense as a bag of chainmail, doesn't ask a single useful question about it. From this very vague origin, the Grail snowballs. Later writers, especially in the 13th century, decide that yes, this is the Holy Grail, the actual cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper, later used to catch his blood at the crucifixion, and then transported to Britain for safekeeping because, well, obviously. They flesh it out with angels, bloodlines, secret keepers, hidden castles, and enough theological symbolism to choke a monastery. Suddenly the Grail isn't just a cup, it's the cup, the key to salvation, the ultimate test of knightly virtue. And of course, Arthur's court becomes the launchpad for the quest. Now, you're probably wondering, how did a story about a semi-mythical British warlords turn into a cosmic scavenger hunt for Christian relics? It's a valid question. The answer? Literary mission creep. By the 12th and 13th centuries, European tastes had shifted. The original Arthur, gritty, tribal, anti-Saxon, wasn't good enough anymore. The medieval audience wanted moral lessons. They wanted allegory. They wanted to believe that knights weren't just sword-wielding jocks, but spiritual athletes, capable of achieving divine union if they were pure enough. Enter the Grail, shimmering with mystery and conveniently just out of reach. And here's where the story really goes off the rails. Because not just any knight can find the Grail. Most fail miserably. Lancelot, despite being the best warrior, is disqualified because of, you guessed it, his affair with Guinevere. Gawain, brave and loyal, also fails. In some versions, he doesn't even seem to try that hard. The one who finally succeeds is Galahad, Lancelot's illegitimate son, who somehow turns out to be too pure for this world, literally. He sees the Grail, achieves spiritual enlightenment, and then dies immediately like a celestial USB drive that's no longer compatible with Earth. And here's your fringe theory flavour for the knight. Some scholars believe the Grail wasn't originally a Christian relic at all. They point to older Celtic cauldron myths, magical vessels that provide endless food, restore the dead, or grant wisdom as the true origin. These cauldrons of plenty show up in Irish and Welsh myth long before Chrétien ever dipped his quill. Over time, the Christian writers may have taken these pagan symbols and grafted them onto their own theology, transforming the cauldron into a chalice and giving it a backstory involving Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea, and a suspicious number of secret guardians. Another theory links the Grail to Gnostic and esoteric traditions, hidden knowledge, sacred bloodlines, and the kind of plot twists that later inspired the Da Vinci Code. According to this line of thought, the Grail isn't a cup at all, but a metaphor for spiritual truth, enlightenment, or even the divine feminine. Yes, it gets that weird. In these versions, the quest is about self-discovery, not shiny tableware. Whatever its origin, the Grail changes Arthur's story dramatically. Suddenly, the Round Table isn't just a political experiment, it's a spiritual battleground. The knights aren't just fighters, they're pilgrims. Their flaws aren't just inconvenient, they're existential deal-breakers. The entire kingdom becomes a metaphor for a world out of balance. The quest for the Grail is the last gasp of purity before everything falls apart. And fall apart it does. The Grail, ironically, signals the beginning of the end for Arthur's court. The knights scatter, fail, and fade. Galahad dies. Lancelot and Guinevere's affair finally explodes into public shame. Mordred seizes power, civil war erupts. By the time Arthur realises what's happened, the kingdom is already burning. So was the Grail worth it? That's the real question. In some versions, the quest is presented as divine will, God testing humanity. In others, it's a distraction, a cruel joke, a holy carrot dangled just out of reach while the kingdom crumbles behind the curtain. Maybe the lesson is that greatness can't survive perfection, that utopias fall apart the second you try to turn them into moral testing grounds. Or maybe the lesson is simply that chasing the impossible has consequences. And here's the debate. Some scholars praise the Grail cycle for deepening the Arthurian myth. giving it weight and spiritual resonance. Others criticise it for hijacking the story, turning a gritty tale of resistance into a sanitised allegory for religious orthodoxy. Arthur becomes a background character in his own saga, overshadowed by the impossible standards set by a magical cup. You stand now at the edge of this metaphysical labyrinth, the echo of chanting knights in your ears, and wonder what Arthur would have thought of it all. Would the real man, if there was one, have recognised any of this? Would he have stared at a glowing cup and asked, "Can it kill Saxons?" Or would he have fallen to his knees, desperate for some sign that all the blood and loss had meaning? We'll never know, but we do know this: the Grail changed everything. It transformed Arthur's story from legend to liturgy, from campfire tale to sacred epic. And whether that's an evolution or a betrayal depends on how much mystery you're willing to drink. You're walking through the drizzle again, because of course you are, along a ridge that might once have overlooked a battlefield or maybe just a sheep pen. The land is soaked with stories, but tonight you're not chasing swords or kings or cups. Tonight you're looking for a body. Arthur's body. Not his memory, not his metaphor, not his moral legacy, his actual physical remains. The bones, the battlefield, the grave. Because if there's one thing that's always lingered in the fog around Arthur's myth, it's that no one can agree on how or even if he died. Let's start with the legend. In most versions, Arthur's end comes at the Battle of Camelot, a grim final showdown where everything collapses. Mordred is there, his illegitimate son, his nephew, his political rival, depending on the telling, and they kill each other in single combat. Sometimes Arthur delivers the final blow and stumbles off to die. Sometimes he's pierced by his own son's blade in a tragic Shakespearean tangle of family drama. But always, it's the end of Camelot, the fall of the dream. And then something strange happens. Arthur doesn't quite die, or at least his death doesn't stick. In many versions, he's taken away, not buried, not burned, but carried off to the mysterious Isle of Avalon, a place that exists somewhere between heaven and hospital. Some say it's a paradise, a land of healing. Others call it a prison. Either way, it's not a tomb. It's a pause, and the people who loved him, his followers, his nation, are left with a story that ends in an ellipsis instead of a period. That's where the once and future king idea comes from. Arthur isn't gone. He's waiting, sleeping beneath a hill, resting in a cave, sailing on an enchanted boat. He'll return when Britain needs him most. And if you think that sounds suspiciously like messianic imagery, you're not alone. Many scholars argue that this narrative borrowed heavily from Christian motifs. Arthur, as a Christ-like figure who will rise again and bring peace, is beautiful, is also totally impossible to verify. So let's get grounded. Where was the Battle of Camelot? And is there any evidence it happened? Well, that depends on who you ask. Some scholars suggest sites in Cornwall or Wales. Others point to northern England, where old place names and oral traditions hint at something grim. The Annales Cambriae, a 10th century Welsh chronicle, mentions a battle at Camelot in 537 AD, in which Arthur and Medrau fell. That's all it says. No details, just two names. Some take this as proof, others see it as later scribal embellishment. And as usual with Arthurian history, the deeper you dig, the more dirt you find, rarely treasure. No mass graves have been found, no weapons caches, no definitive battlefield scars. And for a story with such apocalyptic weight, that's a little frustrating. You'd expect something. A bone, a blade, a brooch. But the silence of the land is loud, almost like it's guarding a secret. Of course, some didn't accept that silence. In 1191, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey claimed to have found Arthur's grave. They said they unearthed a massive coffin beneath a lead cross that read, "Here lies Arthur, King of the Britons, in the Isle of Avalon." Very convenient, especially considering Glastonbury was strapped for cash at the time and had just suffered a devastating fire. A fresh tourist-attracting miracle discovery? Yeah, that'll fix the roof. The monks said the bodies were Arthur and Guinevere. They reburied them in a fancy tomb near the church. Pilgrims flocked in, donations poured out. Everyone was very impressed, until the sceptical started poking holes. For one, the cross was oddly modern in style. For another, the site had long been associated with Arthurian legend, meaning the monks could easily have staged the whole thing. Today, most historians view the Glastonbury grave as a brilliant medieval PR stunt, a kind of myth-based economic stimulus package. Still, the allure remains. Every few years, a new Arthur's Tomb claim pops up somewhere in Britain. A curious stone here, a suspicious burial mound there, and each time the archaeologists line up with their brushes and hopes, and each time the legend outpaces the evidence. The body never turns up. Here's a fringe theory that takes things even further. Some believe Arthur didn't die at Camelot, not even in the narrative sense. They argue that the stories of his death were created later to explain why no one saw him again. That he simply retreated, wounded, tired, disillusioned, and lived out his final days under a different name in the West. Maybe as a monk, maybe as a hermit, maybe as a tired old man who watched the world change around him and decided not to fight anymore. Romantic? Sure. Plausible? That's a stretch. But it underscores something important. People don't want Arthur to die. Not really. They want him to return. The idea that he could come back, that he's still out there, is more powerful than any grave could ever be. That's the fuel behind the myth. And let's not ignore the symbolism here. Arthur's death marks the end of unity, the end of magic, the end of hope. He dies, and Britain breaks. His tomb, if it exists, would be less a grave and more a monument to what could have been. That's why the location doesn't matter as much as the absence. No body means the story never has to end. As long as Arthur isn't in the ground, he might still rise. You stand now at the edge of a windswept hill, imagining that final battle. The clang of steel, the cries of betrayal, the king dragging himself from the carnage to hand his sword to a loyal knight. Or not. Maybe none of it happened. Maybe it all did. But somewhere, out there, under a cairn or behind a monastery wall, the truth might still be waiting. And if you listen closely enough to the wind, you might just hear hooves. Not behind you. Ahead. You walk into a velvet-draped Tudor court and suddenly everything smells like ambition. The air is thick with incense and expensive egos. Servants glide by in embroidered livery. Courtiers whisper in corners, and someone is always making sure the tapestries hang just right. But tonight, you're not here for the gossip. You're here to watch Arthur's myth get a makeover. Because if medieval poets turned Arthur into a chivalric hero, the Tudors turned him into a branding strategy, and they did it with ruthless royal precision. Let's rewind just a bit. It's the late 15th century. England has clawed its way out of the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. Decades of dynastic bloodletting between rival branches of the royal Plantagenet family. Everyone's tired, everything's broken, and the monarchy is basically a traumatised cat hissing from under the furniture. Enter Henry Tudor, a Welshman with a dubious claim to the throne and a very solid PR instinct. When Henry defeats Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, and declares himself King Henry VII, he knows he needs more than swords to hold power. He needs myth. He needs to convince a deeply fractured kingdom that his reign is not only legitimate, it's destiny. And what better way to do that than to revive Britain's most famous, most conveniently Welsh hero? So begins the Tudor reboot of King Arthur. Henry traces his lineage, shakily, to the ancient kings of Britain, including, supposedly, Arthur himself. He pushes this narrative hard, especially in Wales, where Arthur never really left the cultural bloodstream. Suddenly, Arthur isn't just a legend, he's a Tudor legend. A symbol of unity, strength, and British identity at a time when people were desperate for all three. Henry goes all in, he names his first son Arthur. The child is born in 1486 at Winchester, a place already linked to Camelot in the fever dreams of previous historians. The boy is christened with ceremony, praised as the second coming of Britain's greatest king. He's meant to be a living symbol, a callback to a golden age that never existed, but sounded fantastic at banquets. And for a while, it works. The Tudors lean into Arthurian symbolism like it's going out of style. They decorate royal chapels with images of Arthur. They revive chivalric orders, commission new manuscripts, and encourage court poets to write glowing tributes that make Arthur sound like a cross between Hercules and Jesus. The name is everywhere woven into pageantry, politics, and propaganda. But then, young Arthur dies. In 1502, at the age of 15, Prince Arthur succumbs to illness, probably tuberculosis, just months after marrying Catherine of Aragon. It's a national heartbreak and a personal blow to Henry VII's carefully constructed narrative. Suddenly, the second coming of Arthur is dead in a stone-cold bed in Ludlow Castle, and the dream has cracked at the foundation. But Henry isn't about to give up on branding that easily. His next son, Henry VIII, steps into the spotlight. And although he doesn't bear the name Arthur, he carries the torch. He marries Catherine, his brother's widow, and keeps the Arthurian connection alive in the margins. During his reign, the Arthur myth keeps evolving. It becomes less about sacred destiny, and more about national pride. Arthur, as the eternal English hero, the origin point of British greatness. And here's your fringe theory for the evening. Some historians argue that the whole Arthurian boom under the Tudors was designed to replace or at least distract from the Catholic saint cults and continental legends dominating medieval spirituality. Arthur wasn't just a king, he was England's homegrown miracle. No need for foreign saints or relics when you had your own messianic warrior from the misty west. This shift becomes especially noticeable when the Protestant Reformation kicks off. As Henry VIII breaks with Rome, there's a cultural scramble to redefine English identity. Monasteries are dissolved, saints are demoted, relics are trashed, but Arthur sticks around. He becomes a secular saint, a symbol of national virtue, courage and independence. A perfect myth for a kingdom trying to convince itself that it never needed a pope in the first place. And let's not forget Glastonbury. Remember that alleged grave of Arthur discovered back in 1191? During the Tudor period, the story gets dusted off and paraded as more proof that Britain, specifically English Britain, is the rightful inheritor of this ancient legacy. Never mind the fact that Arthur was probably Welsh, and probably wouldn't have recognised a Tudor banquet if it hit him in the face with a roast swan. He's been anglicised, institutionalised, canonised by culture if not by church. Now here comes the scholarly tension. Was this Arthurian revival an authentic attempt to connect with national history, or a cynical PR move? Depends on who you ask. Some argue that the Tudors genuinely believed in the mythic past. Others say it was pure spin. But either way, it worked. The Arthur of the Tudor court is a gleaming, polished symbol. He's no longer trudging through muddy battlefields or hunting boars in old Welsh poems. He's sitting proudly on murals woven into banners, invoked in speeches. You step out of the Tudor court and feel the shift. Arthur isn't just a man now. He's a brand. A legend weaponized. A political tool sharpened to a gleaming point and aimed at the hearts of subjects and rivals alike. And the best part? You don't even need to prove he was real. You just need people to believe that he could be real. That once, long ago, Britain was united under a good and noble king. And that maybe, under the right royal lineage, it could happen again. You watch the court fade into the candlelight, the velvet and gilt dissolving into dream. The myth marches on, not because it's true, but because it's useful. And sometimes, in the halls of power, that's all a story ever needs to be. You kneel in the dirt, fingertips brushing cold stone, a brush in one hand and 100 unanswered questions in your head. Around you the dig site is quiet. Just the low murmur of wind and the occasional cough from a grad student with too little coffee and too much responsibility. You're in the realm of archaeology now. No bards, no magic swords, no stirring speeches, just the stubborn silence of the earth and the slow, gritty work of trying to coax truth out of bones, bricks and rusted iron. Because as much as we love Arthur the myth, what about Arthur the evidence? What, if anything, has the ground given us? The short answer? Not much, not enough, not nearly what you'd hope for considering how much real estate the Arthurian legend takes up in the collective imagination. But the longer answer? That's where things get interesting. Because even without a sword labelled Excalibur or a burial site with a crown still resting on a royal skull, archaeologists have been slowly, painstakingly sketching out the world Arthur might have walked through, if he existed at all. Let's start with the big names. Cadbury Castle, a hill fort in Somerset, has long been one of the prime candidates for real Camelot. Local legends dating back centuries insist Arthur once ruled from here, and when archaeologists finally dug it up in the 1960s, they found something compelling. Extensive fortifications dating back to the exact period Arthur supposedly lived, timber defences, rebuilt gates, imported Mediterranean pottery. Not conclusive proof of Arthur, but the fingerprints of someone powerful trying to hold a community together after Rome abandoned Britain. Then there's Tintagel, perched dramatically on the Cornish coast, where the waves crash against sea-carved cliffs and the wind howls like a ghost choir. Geoffrey of Monmouth placed Arthur's conception here, and while he was probably lying through his Wellynx teeth, archaeology has given the site new weight. Excavations have uncovered high-status buildings and imported goods from the eastern Mediterranean, hinting at a wealthy elite living there during the 5th and 6th centuries. Again, no direct link to Arthur, but a reminder that this wasn't just a wild coastline full of fishermen and sheep. Somebody important was living large in the post-Roman West, but that's the pattern. Interesting sites, rich context, no names. That's the archaeologist's curse. You find a ceremonial dagger in a burial mound and dream of kings. But unless someone was considerate enough to scribble property of Arthur Dux Bellerum on it, you're left with tantalising maybes. And let's talk about artefacts, the weapons, the armour, the everyday objects that might tell us something. What's been found from Arthur's supposed era paints a picture of a Britain in flux. You've got a strange mix of old Roman tech, bits of tile, shards of amphorae, mingling with more native British forms. Post-Roman swords, rough but effective, crop up in various digs. Brooches, belt buckles, and crude pottery show a culture patching itself together with whatever it could salvage. No royal treasure troves, no enchanted gear, just tools for survival in a time that didn't leave a lot of breathing room for sentimentality. And here's a fascinating detail for your late-night myth inventory. No burial site from that era has ever been definitively linked to an Arthur figure. We found elite graves, yes, often under barrows or inside ancient hill forts, but none scream, "Legendary British warlord lay to rest here." No inscriptions, no unique armour, no ceremonial markers that go beyond the standard elite fare. Which makes sense, honestly. If Arthur died in battle, as most stories say, his body may have never been recovered, or it was buried in a hurry, or, if you're leaning into the Avalon theory, it was never meant to be found. Now let's go full fringe for a moment. Some modern-day enthusiasts claim to have found Arthurian artefacts, everything from inscribed stones to swords in bogs. One particularly persistent theory says that a stone in the River Camel, near the town of Slaughterbridge of all places, is the real Excalibur. Others insist that certain Ogham-inscribed stones in Wales or Cornwall carry references to Arthur's real name or lineage, but none of these claims have held up under serious academic scrutiny. Fun? Yes. Proof? Not even close. There's also the issue of anachronism. A lot of what we associate with Arthur, castles, suits of armour, the chivalric code, comes from centuries after his supposed life. So if we did find a castle wall or a knight's coat's helm and tried to label it Arthurian, we'd already be off by about 500 years. That's like discovering a rotary phone and calling it Abraham Lincoln's cell phone. Still, archaeologists keep digging, because even without Arthur, the effort is valuable. It gives us a clearer view of Britain during one of its most obscure periods, a time when the old world was collapsing and something new, chaotic and fragile was taking its place. It shows us communities trying to rebuild, leaders emerging and fading, forts being reinforced then abandoned. 1,000 little stories, none of them about a single man with a magic sword, but all of them feeding into the myth. And there's a deeper question here, one that archaeology isn't really designed to answer. What would finding Arthur even mean? Let's say someone uncovers a 5th century skeleton in a high-status grave, clutching a sword, buried with honours. Let's say the grave is at Cadbury, and carbon dating is perfect, and everything lines up. Would that prove Arthur? Or just prove there was someone around whom the story could have formed? Most scholars agree you'll never find a single artefact that says Arthur was here. You might find a dozen pieces that say someone like Arthur lived, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough. You rise from the dig site, dust on your hands, nothing glittering in the soil, but a stronger sense of the world that once was, the people who lived in it, the hopes they carried, the stories they passed down. Maybe the real Arthur isn't buried under stone, maybe he's in the absence, the longing for a hero strong enough to hold a nation together when everything else is falling apart. That's what archaeology gives us. Not answers, but echoes. And sometimes echoes are louder than facts. You're in a library now, dust thick on the shelves, the kind of place where the air tastes like paper and time. The lamps buzz faintly. Somewhere a page turns, slow and deliberate. Tonight, you're not following swords or footsteps, but words. Those finely crafted fictions and half-truths that have built Arthur's legend over 1,000 years. And perched on the top of this teetering tower of tales is one Thomas Malory, a 15th century knight-turned-writer-turned-prisoner, who decided to take all the scattered pieces of the Arthur story and press them into one thick, melancholic, utterly definitive volume, Le Mot d'Arthur. Written sometime around 1469 and first published in 1485 by the pioneering printer William Caxton, Le Mot d'Arthur isn't just another retelling, it's the moment Arthur goes full Shakespearean tragedy. Before Malory, the legend was fragmented. Welsh poems here, French romances there, propaganda in between. But Malory gathered it all, sorted it, and forged it into one grand narrative, equal parts noble, violent, and heartbreakingly human. Malory's Arthur is older, wiser, wounded. He's still noble, still inspiring, but everything around him seems to rot. His knights can't keep their vows, his queen betrays him, his best friend becomes his worst regret. His kingdom, so painstakingly built, crumbles under the weight of human failure. It's not a fairy tale, it's not even a story about triumph, it's a slow-motion collapse, beautifully written. And the tone is everything. Malory doesn't give us cheerful feasts or dazzling quests for the sake of it, he gives us melancholy. Even in the victories there's a sense of decay, of inevitability. The Round Table starts strong, sure, but even then there are cracks. Lancelot's forbidden love, Gawain's wrath, Mordred biding his time. Malory doesn't sugarcoat it. This isn't a tale about how glorious Camelot was, it's about how it couldn't last. Here's something people forget. Malory didn't write this from some sunlit tower. He likely wrote Le Morte d'Arthur from prison, possibly for theft, more possibly for political rebellion, maybe even worse depending on which version of his biography you believe. He was a man who'd seen the inside of dungeons, who'd watched noble causes unravel. That bitterness, that disappointment, it's all over the page. His Arthur is a man doing his best while everything falls apart around him. A king who believes in virtue while surrounded by very human failings. Malory isn't inventing characters so much as rehabilitating them. He takes the chaotic energy of earlier tales and gives it narrative gravity. He humanises Lancelot, not just a heroic knight, but a man tortured by love and loyalty. Guinevere becomes a tragic figure, not just a plot device. Even Mordred, the snake in the garden, gets a little pathos. Everyone is flawed, everyone suffers, everyone believes in their own way that they're doing the right thing. And then there's the language. Malory's prose is blunt, powerful, and full of this strange, dignified sadness. There's a rhythm to it, a simplicity that reads like prayer. He doesn't dwell on introspection. He lets the action speak. When Lancelot weeps, when Arthur forgives, when Bedivere finally throws Excalibur into the lake after 2 tries, because letting go is hard, even for fictional characters. Now for a curious fringe tidbit. There's an academic theory that Le Morte d'Arthur was Malory's coded commentary on the Wars of the Roses, the brutal dynastic conflict tearing England apart in his time. Some believe Arthur's crumbling kingdom reflects Malory's own anxieties about civil war and the loss of noble ideals. The infighting, the betrayal, the tragic fall, it's all eerily familiar. Malory might have been holding up a mirror to his own world, cloaked in myth to protect himself from political backlash. Then Caxton gets hold of it. He prints it, standardises it, and gives it a title that practically rings like a bell. Le Morte d'Arthur, the death of Arthur, final, inevitable. But Caxton's title also fixes the narrative's tone, emphasising the end, the failure, the sorrow. And that framing sticks. For centuries Malory's version becomes the version, the one English readers return to again and again, the source of inspiration for later writers, artists and dreamers who fall in love with Camelot's doomed nobility. And here's where things really ripple out. Because from Malory we get everything else. Tennyson's Idylls of the King, Victorian paintings of tragic queens and shining knights, Broadway musicals, Hollywood blockbusters, even animated squirrels teaching swordsmanship. Every time you see Arthur as a weary but righteous king, every time Lancelot broods handsomely in moonlight, every time Guinevere looks out a window and sighs, you're seeing the ghost of Malory's pen. But his story doesn't offer neat conclusions. There's no glorious victory. Arthur goes to war against his own son, kills him, and is mortally wounded in return. His kingdom collapses, his loyal knights die or scatter, and yet, even here, there's the slimmest, faintest thread of hope. Arthur is taken to Avalon, not buried, not gone, just waiting. You close the book now, the pages feel heavy, like they've soaked up centuries of grief and admiration. Malory gave us a version of Arthur that isn't just idealistic, it's mournful, and in doing so he made the legend feel real. Because what story is more universal than watching something beautiful fall apart, and wishing somehow that it didn't have to? You step out of the library. The echo of those last words following you like smoke. Here lies Arthur, the once and future king. And whether you believe that or not, it still catches in your throat a little. Because maybe the best stories don't teach us how to win. Maybe they teach us how to lose with honour. Now the walls start to dissolve, the armour fades, the castles flicker, and you step into the modern age, where King Arthur isn't just a figure of old texts, he's a cultural shapeshifter. You're in the 19th and 20th centuries now, a time of revolutions, steam engines, tea rooms, world wars and typewriters. The world has changed, but Arthur? He refuses to leave. Instead, he re-emerges over and over again. Different costumes, same soul. And what's strange is that each age doesn't just retell the legend, it reinvents it for its own fears, its own dreams, its own longing. The Victorians go first, and boy do they go hard. This is an era of empire, of idealised masculinity, of obsession with duty and honour. Enter Alfred, Lord Tennyson, who writes Idylls of the King, a long, dreamy, emotionally overwrought retelling of the Arthur story. But this isn't your muddy wild Arthur from the Welsh hills. This is a moral Arthur, a noble ideal slowly crushed under the weight of human weakness. He's less a warlord and more a sermon in shining armour. Tennyson's work becomes a mirror for the Victorian soul. Arthur is the high standard no one can live up to. Guinevere's infidelity, a cautionary tale, Lancelot's passion, a crack in the foundation. Even the Grail becomes less about mystery and more about moral purification. Victorian readers lap it up. Arthur becomes a symbol not of military might or political unity, but of personal virtue, of lost greatness, of a time when men were supposedly better, and women sighed dramatically in gardens. But the legend doesn't stop there. In the early 20th century, as the world begins to fracture under the weight of global war, Arthur becomes something else entirely. A refuge, a nostalgic escape hatch. Writers like T.H. White, who's the once and future king, becomes one of the most beloved Arthurian retellings of all time, reshape the myth for a world that no longer believes in shining armour, but still aches for meaning. White's Arthur is gentle, thoughtful, a king who learns more from falcons and fish than from swords. He grows from a bumbling boy named Wart into a ruler who genuinely wants to fix things, to make people better, but he can't, because people, as White reminds us over and over, are terribly human. The book is funny and cit and brilliant all at once, and by the time Arthur lays his head down at the end, quietly broken, quietly hopeful, you realise this is a story about acceptance. The hope that even in failure something good can endure. The mid-century adaptations keep the softer tone. Disney adapts White's early chapters into a cartoon, the kind with singing squirrels and animated teapots. Arthur becomes a child again. Magic is light-hearted, the stakes are low, but the message is the same. Greatness isn't about strength, it's about learning. About choosing kindness in a world that makes it hard. Then come the 60s and 70s, and everything gets strange again. The counterculture takes a swing at Arthur, and suddenly the myth is being deconstructed. Camelot, the Broadway musical and later film, leans into tragedy wrapped in elegance. Arthur sings about idealism while watching it rot. Meanwhile, Monty Python and the Holy Grail absolutely shreds the legend, poking fun at everything from divine rule to sacred quests to coconuts standing in for horses. But even in satire, the myth persists. People laugh, but they know the characters. Arthur, Lancelot, the Lady of the Lake. These figures are so culturally baked in that even parody can't dislodge them. And here's your fringe academic flavour for the evening. Some scholars argue that Arthur is less a person and more a cultural litmus test. The Arthur you get tells you what a culture fears, what it wants, what it thinks it's lost. Victorians wanted moral certainty. Post-war authors wanted forgiveness. Satirists wanted to puncture pomp. Each time Arthur delivers, not because he's real, but because he's flexible. He's a symbol that can be worn like a coat, stitched from whatever fabric the times provide. Now, push forward to the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Arthur gets darker, grittier. The fantasy genre takes him back, dragons, warlords, brooding queens. Shows like Merlin flip the lens entirely, turning Arthur into a supporting character in someone else's story. Sometimes he's a tyrant, sometimes he's clueless, sometimes he's a teenager with great hair and questionable decision-making skills. The myths are pulled apart, gender-swapped, reset in space, rebooted as comic books. Every possible angle, every genre, Arthur pops up like a familiar face in a new crowd. But underneath it all, the same structure remains. The good king, the broken kingdom, the betrayal, the sword, the fall, the hope. And now you're watching Arthur morph again. In a world obsessed with anti-heroes and cynicism, Arthur sometimes feels too good, too earnest, so modern writers twist him. What if he was ruthless? What if the good kingdom was built on lies? What if Guinevere was the real power behind the throne? What if Mordred had a point? These aren't attempts to destroy the myth. They're attempts to humanize it, to understand it, to ask why we still care, because we do still care. Every generation, someone dusts off the old stories and says, let's try again. And it works. Arthur keeps coming back like he promised. Not in shining armour, not riding through the mists, but in pages, in pixels, in podcasts, in movies. You don't have to believe in magic to feel something stir when a sword rises from water or a king kneels at a battlefield, knowing the end has come. You sit now at the edge of a screen, scrolling, streaming, reading, and realise something. Arthur may have started in the mud and mist of post-Roman Britain, but he lives in your search bar, in your bookshelf, in your craving for stories that remind you of what could be, what should be, what almost was. He's not gone, he's just upgraded. Now you're standing at the edge of it all. Thousands of years of storytelling humming behind you like static. And ahead, well, ahead is silence. Or maybe it's possibility. Because after everything, the battles, the betrayals, the ballads, the books, what does Arthur mean now? Not just as a king or a character, but as a cultural idea. As a mirror, we keep turning back toward ourselves, generation after generation, hoping to see something noble reflected in the glass. Here's the truth no one likes to admit. We've never needed Arthur less, and yet we've never wanted him more. We live in an age of algorithms, of surveillance capitalism, of deep fakes and supply chain breakdowns, and a planet slowly cooking under our feet. Kings, knights, honour, it all sounds like a weird fever dream. And yet, Arthur keeps showing up. He's everywhere. Not in armour maybe, but in our hunger for leadership, our longing for justice, our obsession with what went wrong. Every time a system fails, every time trust erodes, we dig out that old myth and whisper, once things were better. Even if they weren't. Arthur has become the ghost of a good idea. He's the leader who rules by virtue, not by fear. The king who fights not for conquest, but for fairness. He's the guy who listens to counsel, admits when he's wrong, and believes, against all odds, that peace is possible if people just try hard enough. In a world of performative politics and corporate overlords, Arthur is a breath of medieval fresh air. Unrealistic? Absolutely. Necessary? Somehow also yes. But here's the twist. Arthur doesn't work alone. His legend requires betrayal, it requires flaw. Camelot falls, the Round Table shatters, the Grail is never brought back. This isn't just a story about glory, it's about failure. And how people keep trying anyway. It's the trying that matters. Maybe that's why the story has lasted. Not because Arthur wins, but because he wants to. Because he believes in something larger than himself. The kingdom is never perfect. The people are never saints. The dream collapses every time. But even in ruin there's grace. Arthur always forgives Lancelot. He always mourns Guinevere. He always goes to war against Mordred only when he has no choice. He's not a god. He's not even always a good king, but he's better than most. He wants to be better. And in the dark, that counts for something. Let's talk about you for a second, because if you've made it this far, if you've stayed with me through battles and books, through mythology and mud, you're not just a tourist. You're in this story now, and maybe you see a little of yourself in it. Not the sword-wielding, dragon-slaying bits. But the hope, the exhaustion, the feeling that maybe, if we could just build something fair, something kind, maybe it would last this time. Maybe it wouldn't. But still, we try. And here's your final fringe theory, one that's more feeling than fact. Some believe Arthur was never a single man, not a general, not a king, not even a legend, but an idea that floated between people, a campfire conversation, a name passed from tongue to tongue like a promise, that every time someone stood up to injustice, every time someone chose mercy over vengeance, someone nearby said, that was Arthur. And slowly, that idea became a person, a face, a story, a sword, a pea. Maybe that's why we can't find his grave, because he's not buried. He's echoed, passed forward in chance and story, until someone needs him again. You sit now in the quiet, breathing in that old steady rhythm the tale has always had. Rise, fall, rise again. The future waits. The world is still broken. The Round Table is just an idea, but so is Arthur. And maybe that's enough. So when someone asks you what the real King Arthur story is, the one the history books hide, you tell them this. He wasn't a king. He was a question. Can one good person change the world? And maybe, just maybe, the answers are still out there. And now you exhale, deep and slow, the kind of breath that feels like it belongs in a cathedral or a cave. You've walked the long road with Arthur, from the blood-slick hills of post-Roman Britain to the echo chambers of modern myth. You've heard 100 voices claim to know the truth. You've stood in rain-swept ruins and crumbling libraries, sat beside dying kings and dreaming poets, and still, Arthur doesn't resolve. He doesn't explain himself. He just waits. Maybe that's why he lasts. He's a myth, sure, but he's a myth with just enough dirt under his fingernails to make you wonder. He might have been a Roman commander, a Celtic warlord, a Welsh folk hero, or no one at all. Just an echo that sounded too good to let go. And when history didn't give us what we needed, we made it up. We had to, because we need stories like this. Not to escape the world, but to reshape it. To say, this is what it could look like. This is who we could be. Arthur isn't about the sword. He's about the reach. The risk of standing for something, even if it breaks your heart. So when you go to bed tonight, let the idea rest with you. The king who almost was. The dream that keeps trying to be real. Somewhere beneath the noise of now, he's still out there. Sword gleaming, cloak catching the wind, a question waiting to be answered. Close your eyes, let the torches burn low. The hall is quiet, the mist rising. Camelot may be gone, but the story still rides.